Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Deku was a necromancer? This amazing story was written by Magnus9284. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. A sinister fallout. The normally explosive blonde known as Katsuki Bakugo stared at the young woman who'd become his roommate just a week ago with a look bubbling, if barely muted, aggravation. If the two had originally met under more normal circumstances, i.e. not forced to room together in an institution of all places, the bomber had come to accept he'd have probably never given the spider girl a second glance. And it wasn't that he found her appearance frightening or some bullshit reason like that. No, what pissed him off was the Sylvette's self-perceived greatness. After all, he was the best. And if he'd never heard of someone before, not even rumors, then they must have not ever been too important. Right? Who again? Bakugo rumbled the words, deriving a spark of amusement from watching the Sylvette fume at his continued questioning. Antagonizing his newest roommate had gotten to be almost a habit by this point, although the practice did have its drawbacks, like being unable to keep from setting the spider girl off in the mess hall during breakfast, for example. In her seat sitting across from her irksome roommate, Junko Kano fumed. Junko Kano, damn it. The infuriated shout was accompanied by the Arachne-esque teen slamming her fists down onto the two's shared table. In the fading echo of the strike's thunderous boom, the scratching of scythe blades skittering across the linoleum floor could be faintly heard as Kano's arachnoid limbs twitched under her restrained anger. I was the #1 idol of Japan, and you know it. Stop being a Neanderthal this instant. The female arachnator wiped what definitely weren't tears from her eyes, as she felt her rage cool as quickly as it had come. She refused to accept the reality she was being presented with. She knew what her powder keg of a roommate was doing, but still, the idea that she'd been forgotten by the public so quickly was excruciating to her soul. It hadn't even been 6 months since her fall from grace. I get that you were supposedly an idol, Legs, but I'm telling you, no one remembers you. Bakugo said, punctuating his point as he played with his food using the insult to silverware that was the plastic spork. The abomination was the only type of eating utensil the staff gave out during meal times. Lily Hashikawa. That's the only idol I've heard of recently. Stupid old hag and her shitty TV shows. Even with his zero interest in the floundering idol industry, Bakugo was sure he would have remembered an idol of high enough caliber to be proclaimed as the best in Japan. The Sylvette now pouting across from him. She definitely hadn't rung any bells, and still didn't even now. The child idol. That's who you're comparing me to. Kano nearly shrieked. The skittering sounds picked up again, clearly indicating the Arachne-esque teen's continuously building stress. To look at her, it would seem the Sylvette was ready to deck the blonde sitting across from her at any second, choice of limb pending. And why were you looking at child idols anyway? Holy fuck, are you a Lilicon? Bakugo's response was immediate and no less violent than should have been expected. I am not a Lilicon. The blonde roared, slamming his own hands onto the two's table and jumping to his feet. The mistreated furniture creaked and groaned from its sudden and unrelenting mistreatment. Acting on instinct, which was to always lash out, Bakugo pointed an accusing finger at his roommate and spoke again. You're just a delusional wannabe who can't accept the fact that she never made it as big as she thought. This colorful confrontation was the day's end result of the two confrontational teens acting as each other's therapeutic listener once again. Neither Bakugo nor Kano had been getting anywhere meaningful with the institution's staff of therapists since they'd arrived, and in response the director had decided to task the two with hearing each other out instead. This was how the blonde had come to learn of the Sylvette's tragic past. Flashback equals. Siriidii Institution, Room 214. This idea is shit. Bakugo had spat, slouched against the wall his bunk rested against. Why had Bokamona even suggested this? He'd already been here for a few days, and the spider girl hadn't said a peep since he'd arrived. Even now, the Sylvette that he'd been told to call Junko Kano had refused to say even a word to him. Instead, she had spent all of her time looking out their shared window at the ocean beyond with cold, empty ice-blue eyes. After getting bored of non-stop silence, even the normally standoffish bomber had begun to itch for conversation. Come on, Legs. Bakugo had eventually barked, tossing his pillow at his uncooperative roommate's head. Faster than his eyes had been able to follow, one of the Sylvette's extra arachnoid limbs had snapped out and speared the feather-filled cushion through. Kano herself hadn't even turned away from the window. The blonde had only been able to gape at the move. Soon enough, however, the bomber's more normal, comfortable anger came rushing back. The fuck was that for? That was mine. In the blink of an eye, Kano had seemed to snap, turning and skittering toward him. Before he could react, the Sylvette had boxed Bakugo in by surrounding him with her spider legs. Then you should not have thrown it at me. The words had been said with such a calm, almost soft voice. It had been completely different from how Bakugo had been used to dealing with those of the female gender, his mother being his only real experience. This unexpected turn had caused the blonde's brain to sputter for a moment. When he'd snapped out of it, the bomber had been too late to realize Kano had already retaken her spot by the window. Finally, Bakugo had shouted, immediately noticing his roommate tense. Brushing off how easily the Sylvette had cornered him, the explosive blonde had pushed himself to his feet, unwilling to let the little bit of progress he'd made slip away. He might have thought Bokemona's idea was idiotic, but he honestly had nothing better to do at the moment, and he'd known the giant would ask him if he'd even tried later. So spill legs. It's not like I really care or anything, but what the fuck did you do to wind up here? Even facing away from him, Bakugo had been able to tell that Kano had struggled not to answer him. It appeared that breaking her silence even once had weakened her will to remain so. Strategic mind finally fully engaged into his task, the blonde quickly decided to go with a tried-and-true method to get what he wanted when force wasn't an option. Pestering. Some would call it bullying, but weak shits like that didn't matter anyway. Right? Come on. Just spit it out already and save us both the trouble. Bakugo had continued to press. What was so bad I existed. That voice that had sounded so soft only moments ago rasped as it had reached a limit any listener could have realized it hardly ever pressed. Bakugo had flinched at the volume, instinctively ducking his head for an instant through sheer muscle memory. Staring wide-eyed at the now panting Sylvette, the blonde had leaned back, confused but satisfied he'd actually gotten somewhere. I doubt that legs, Bakugo had snarked. They don't throw people in places like this for just being born. Why don't you try pulling the other fucking one, and start from the beginning, and make some goddamn sense now that you seem to be so chatty? Kano's face had twitched at his words, a scowl quickly hidden behind her blank mask. But for all her effort, the Sylvette hadn't been able to hide the internal struggle that had been visible if one had looked into her eyes. Not that he had been, of course. The spider girl had just been incredibly easy to read once the blonde had gotten a good look at her face. With a long, drawn-out sigh, Kano had eventually shifted her position by the window. The new placement had allowed the Arachne-esque teen to side-eye her roommate, while still easily being able to glance out the window if she chose. With slumped shoulders, Kano had taken one last, shaky breath. I was born in Kyushu, to a middle-class family of no real importance. The Arakitor had begun, almost immediately fiddling with her fingers she'd had clasped in front of her. Around him. Fuck, I was shit out right here in Mizuta-fu. Bakugo had interrupted with a snort, unable to resist. Again, how the fuck did a country girl like you end up in this shithole? A pillow, of his own, to the face had been the Sylvette's immediate response. Growling, the bomber had thrown the offending cushion off, glaring daggers at the perpetrator. Had there been the smallest of smirks on the spider girl's face for a split second? Are you going to listen or not? Kano had asked after a moment of silence. Bakugo had only huffed and folded his arms with a scowl. Having seen her roommate's response, the Arachnitor had miraculously decided to continue. As I was saying, around my 4th birthday my quirk manifested for the first time. Bakugo's brows had furrowed at that. Mutant quirks like Kano's should have been active since birth, the physical attributes of them anyway. Seeing her roommate's confusion, the Sylvette had let out a hollow laugh. This, the spider girl had said, gesturing to her arachnoid lower body, is not the result of my quirk alone. For some reason, that admittance had set a sense of foreboding in Bakugo's gut. However, by this point the blonde had come too far to pussy out of hearing his roommate's story in its entirety. My quirk was actually an emitter type, originally, Kano said, moving on with her story with a wistful sigh. I could produce a silk-type substance from my body that could be woven into a thread that was literally 10 times stronger than a majority of the textiles even the major support companies could produce. At the time, he hadn't reacted, but Bakugo had been slightly impressed at the information. While it hadn't been able to compare to his own quirk, Kano's ability to create such a material, if not an exaggeration, had the potential to have every hero support company in the world interested in her. Hell, as the future #1 hero, even he had been interested in the prospect of a suit that could keep up with his awesomeness. But it hadn't been enough for me. Kano's sudden words snapped the blonde from his thoughts. The Spider Girl's fidgeting hands were now clenched into fists. Before I'd even turned 5, I'd fallen in love with the idea of becoming an idol. I was completely obsessed. I was going to be the one who captured the heart of the world, no matter what. Now that Bakugo had been able to appreciate, the idea of idols may have been stupid, not even equal to the crappiest of heroes in his opinion, but that fearless, unconquerable drive the bomber had seen in his roommate's eyes had been something to see. And then it had snuffed itself out. But I quickly realized I had a problem, Kano said, a sharpness edging into her voice. I may not have lacked in charisma or charm, but when puberty decided to hit me early, it came with another curse in addition to the one I'd expected. 2 of the Sylvette's arachnoid limbs had snaked out from under her at that point, maneuvering to arch outward like a pair of featherless wings. Bakugo had focused on his roommate's actions, and not the image her words could have otherwise engendered. These 2 sprouted from my lower back one night, with no warning, Kano had explained, curling one of the limbs inward and running a gentle finger along its exoskeleton. I nearly had a heart attack. Having any mutant features would have immediately ended my aspirations. I had to think quickly. Bakugo had been unable to look away at the almost tender way Kano had caressed one of her arachnoid limbs. The blonde's breath had abruptly caught when he'd seen scars running down the width of the limb's patella. Luckily, I had a stroke of genius before I went too far, Kano had eventually said, having side-eyed her unusually quiet roommate and witnessing the blonde stare openly at what remained of her scars. Hopefully, one day, a molting would erase at least that mistake from her life. I ended up thinking of using my silk to craft a pair of angel wing-like coverings for my new additions. The Sylvette had sighed again, looking out the window at the view that had filled her days since she'd arrived at the Institute. A look of sheer longing had crossed her face then. Bakugo, suddenly impatient, had not so subtly coughed to regain her attention. This time, the irritated look had gone unhidden. He'd met it with one of his own. Every outfit I made from that day forward had my wings included in them, a disguise hidden in plain sight, Kano said, returning her gaze to the window's view. My angelic appearance must have pressed some special buttons, because suddenly I was exploding onto the modeling scene within a few weeks. Modeling? Bakugo had begun to get aggravated as soon as the sense of foreboding in his stomach had lessened. Leg's story had been all right to start with, but to the blonde it had appeared as if the Sylvette had begun to go off on a tangent. And then, my chance of a lifetime, Kano had continued, seemingly unaware of her roommate's growing frustration. The Spider Girl's ice-blue eyes had glazed then, seeing only memories. I was invited to participate in a regional idol contest. Bakugo had rolled his eyes. I won by a landslide. Kano had said, only the faintest traces of smugness present, only nostalgia remaining. That victory is how I met the biggest idol producers in Japan, and Ai Mizuno. That had rung a bell with Bakugo, but he hadn't been able to remember why at the time. It had only added to his growing frustration, and the blonde had nearly missed the almost venomous way the Sylvette had spat the other girl's name. At the time, she was just another idol hopeful that had won the contest from another region, Kano had explained. Tone returned to neutral. The 2 of us and 4 others were to be part of a plan by the producers to create a band of top idols to revive the industry. A wistful, almost melancholy look had fallen upon the Sylvette's face at that moment as she had gazed out at the ocean beyond. Bakugo, who'd only minutes ago been nearly pinned by the Spider Girl, was weirded out that his roommate could vacillate between emotions so quickly. One of the things he'd always prided himself on was having crushed his weaker emotions long ago. Only those like his stalwart confidence and comforting rage had been allowed to remain. Only the most powerful for the best hero. The producers ran into an unexpected problem, however. Kano had continued. completely ignoring the fact that Bakugo had almost slipped away into his own thoughts. Our prodigal group could only sit one leader. Of course, of the 6 of us gathered, only myself was fit for the position, but Mizuno didn't see it that way. The explosive blonde had snorted, silently nodding along. It hadn't been hard to see that Legs thought highly of herself, once one had gotten through her mask of indifference and reached the fire below. The bomber had felt a strange sense of camaraderie with the Sylvette then. He'd known exactly how it felt to know your place was at the top, yet of others constantly getting in your way. We argued extensively about the leadership position, Kano had further said, hands once again fidgeting together with a sense of vaguely remembered frustration. Our quarrels led to the group's debut being delayed 3 whole days. That uninspiring little tramp insisted I hand over my wings if I wanted her to step aside, as a sign of good faith, she put it. But that would have been unacceptable. Bakugo had really starting to dislike this Mizuno chick. Well, more than he disliked most people in general anyway. Of course, if Legs hadn't squashed her competition immediately in the first place, then that had to mean either the Sylvette wasn't as big as she thought she'd been, or the bitch was actually the better idol and deserved the position after all. In a rare moment of objectivity, the explosive blonde had decided to reserve judgment until and if he ever met this other idol. Honestly, he really didn't care. Honestly. Eventually, we agreed to a compromise. Kano had admitted after having taken in her roommate's slowly devolving facial expressions and completely misreading them. I kept my wings, and my secret, and the leadership of the group would to be set on a rotation between Mizuno and I. The listening bomber had scowled all the more at that information. The best didn't give in. The best didn't negotiate with their enemies. The best kicked ass and stood above their competition no matter what. The best blazed a trail of victory through every battle that came their way. The best weren't locked away like a crazy. Bakugo had had to forcibly pull his mind away from that suddenly spiraling line of thinking. Gritting his teeth, the blonde had snapped his head to the side, in no way trying to hide how shameful his unheroic thoughts had been. Believing her audience's actions indicated their loss of interest in her story, Kano had skipped straight to the night when her nightmare had begun. There was a party afterward, the Sylvette had said, relaxing only slightly when her roommate hadn't seemed to ignore her words. Mizuno invited me personally. She said she wanted to bridge the gap that had grown between us and work out our differences away from prying eyes. Bakugo's head had snapped back up so sharply it had nearly popped. Had Legs really walked into such an obvious trap? Maybe he'd overestimated the Spider Girl's intelligence if she hadn't been able to see what her rival had been setting up. It hadn't been like his own situation, where Romero had somehow gotten to the faculty of UA and turned them all against him. The bomber hated all that subterfuge shit with a passion for a reason. It was only after I arrived that I discovered the party's main attraction. Kano had whispered while wrapping her arms around herself. And if I'd known, I swear I would have never had gone. An explosive blonde eyebrow had risen at such a declaration. What kind of shit had Leg's stupidity dragged her into? Alcohol? Strippers? There was T-Trigger. Bakugo would forever deny the shiver that had crawled up his spine at the mention of the illicit drug. It had only been in that following instant, however, that the blonde had realized just what kind of deep shit his roommate had been led into. Even prime hero material like himself had known that you didn't mess with Trigger at all. The street drug was infamous for its multitude of side effects and its prevalence of users who were villains. Even being caught in the same room as the stuff was usually a one-way ticket onto a watch list for the rest of your life, an instant death to any aspirations you had as well. No one, on the up and up at least, did business with a person if they were connected to Trigger in any way. Ever. It happened so fast. Kano had whimpered, the memory almost as painful as the original experience. Mizuno had stepped away to get us drinks, and the next thing I knew a stranger had grabbed me and pinned me against a wall. Bakugo had grit his teeth for a whole new reason than before at that. He might have had issues with the old hag, but she'd bashed some things into his head hard enough to stick. The mental image of some tweaked-out shooter taking advantage of a girl while high had pissed him right the fuck off. But that hadn't been the worst of it. Not by a long shot. Another came forward. Kano had forced out, falling deeper into her trauma, eyes wild. He stuck me with a needle. I thought I was going to die. Oh, or worse. It's shameful, but I be blacked out right after. Sometimes. I think it might have been better if I'd never woken up. The explosive blonde had shot off his bed right then, molten wrath rocketing him forward. But before Bakugo could even growl out a word, however, raging crimson had met breaking ice. Instantly, white-hot fury had seemed to extinguish to embers. The whiplash of emotion had stumbled the bomber, and he'd frozen in place inches from a wide-eyed and shocked Kano. Don't ever say that. Bakugo had spat each word out like the explosions he'd used to toss around like free candy. Shit like that is the worst. I'll admit, I don't know you legs, but you don't seem like the kind of punk-ass bitch who'd off themselves just because a couple of shooters got loo. Slap. I woke up a freak, you vulgar oaf. The slap had been somewhat expected, but the tears following the shout had made the explosive blonde uncomfortable for some reason. Why? He hadn't been able to say, and before the bomber could think more on it, his roommate had pulled herself together enough to continue. The needle that man stuck me with was a dose of American Black Springfield, Kano had said, shaking once more. I'm sure someone like you must have heard of it, right? A trigger strain so powerful its effects can actually remain permanently for the right user. Bakugo had only been able to nod at the rapid-fire words spilling from the Sylvette in front of him. The longer she'd gone, the faster she'd spoken, vomiting up who knew how much pent-up frustration and anguish. The minute I woke up, I realized my body had reacted intensively to the dosage I'd been given. Kano had said, speaking almost too fast to follow by the end. Drug-induced mutations are rare, it turns out, but when they occur, they're oftentimes fatal whenever the initial catalyst would wear off. But in my case, it was permanent, wasn't it? Bakugo had said, voice low at the revelation. Kano had nodded, tears continuing to stain trails down her reddened cheeks. It was hell, the Sylvette had whispered in return. The first thing my manager said to me when he called was that he was severing our contract immediately. He refused to work with someone who looked so hideous they couldn't even go out in public without causing a panic. And that wasn't all. Bakugo had stood, head down, eyes shadowed as he'd taken in the cruel fate of Junko Kano. The idol group's producers sent a text, spelling out my expulsion from their project. Kano continued, wiping a few tears away only to sob right after. Apparently word of my condition had already gone viral, and no one believed my innocence. A rising idol falling from grace after being caught using trigger was a much more salacious story apparently. The bomber had only given a shallow nod, having figured that was likely what would happen. He'd learned well the bias of those who only wanted to believe in the exaggerated side of things. Even my family abandoned me, Kano had finally said, collapsing against the window, spent. I was a freak, a monster, and no daughter of my father's. He disowned me before I could even set foot in my childhood home. Only hours after being released from the hospital, I'd woken up in. Bakugo had felt his fingers twitch at the sight before him. The arachnator had looked so devastated, her spider limbs curled up and around her as she caved under the weight of her plight. She hadn't been able to look at him as she'd finished her story. I couldn't take it. Kano had hoarsely gotten out around her tears and shaking. I just broke down. The next thing I can remember clearly is waking up here, at Siriadii, staring down at the wreck of a girl sprawled across her bed. Bakugo had felt something within him ignite. Leg's story, as annoyingly long as it had been like his own. They had both been headed to the top, both the best at what they did. And then, just like that, someone had taken it all away. It had been jarring for him, but as Bakugo had stood there, alone in his room with a girl he'd only known for a few days at the most, he'd felt the oddest sense of camaraderie. And like a spark on a stick of dynamite, the blonde bomber had had an epiphany, a plan to take it all back. Equals flashback, E&E equals. Present day, Siriadii Institution, Mess Hall. What? Kano's shriek snapped Katsuki from his reminiscing, an annoying habit he'd picked up from Bokamona. Realizing he'd been standing like a goddamn fool, the blonde grouchily sat back down in his chair, ignoring the overly dramatic hurt his roommate was projecting due to being forgotten so easily like a little bitch. I don't want to hear that from a delusional buffoon who thinks fireworks and a sailor's tongue are the trademarks of a pro hero. Needless to say, after Junko had recovered from telling her story the next day, and basically guilt tripped him into it, Katsuki had shared his own. Instead of showing any signs of sympathy, which the bomber would have hated anyway, the Sylvette had taken his words in and almost immediately declared the blonde a foul-mouthed narcissist with delusions of grandeur. The second coming of All Might, she had assured him, he was not. Of course, she had been able to relate to the blonde's smoldering hatred for a certain Romero person that he had kept going on about. The creep sounded like a master manipulator, able to orchestrate events so that the bomber's entire life crumbled to ruin. He'd even managed to land him in a mental institution of all things. But the collateral damage the oaf had tried to brush off? That was concerning to the Sylvette. I will become the #1 hero. Bakugo raged, agitation boiling over as his faint amusement choked on his wounded pride. It'll take more than this to keep me down. The blonde slammed another fist into the shared table, ignoring the resulting groan in favor of leveling a judgmental glare at the arachnitor standing across from him. I'm not like you legs, Bakugo spat, crossing his arms completely unlike a petulant child. I don't give the fuck up at the first obstacle that comes my way. You know, if you really wanted that stupid fucking dream of yours, you'd just get OFF your ASS and find another goddamn manager already. By this point, neither the blonde bomber nor the Arachne-esque Sylvette seemed to care any longer that they weren't alone in the mess hall. Not that blow-ups such as this hadn't happened before, far from it in fact. Since the second day the two had been put together, their time in public had become infamously punctuated with the downright apocalyptic arguments the two would get into. And just as with every other time one of these disagreements had come about, the other residents were left to cower away from the two, scared out of their minds. Each gave the combatants as much space as possible, unwilling to get between the two who looked ready to commit murder. You stupid vulgar oaf, Kano screamed, sharp arachnoid limbs piercing the floor as if stabbing someone to death. The Sylvette gestured to her mutated lower extremities. And just who do you imagine would want to sponsor this kind of body, huh? It's not like you're fucking ugly or anything legs. Bakugo roared back, no longer able to watch his words. So I'd say pretty much any damn asshole with a brain. Silence. The entire mess hall could hardly blink through the collective shock. Had the notorious new resident of the Siriidii Institute really just said that? What? Kano stammered, unable to believe her ears. Had she really just heard that? Had she really just heard the words that she'd been aching to hear since her life had become a waking nightmare? Instead of answering, Bakugo returned his attention to his rapidly cooling food, studiously ignoring the now pink-cheeked arachnitor as she sputtered away. The bomber's shaggy hair, combined with his downturned look, did an adequate job of hiding the faint trace of red that was rebelliously heating his stone-set face. Heck, Kano managed to call out through her whirlwind of emotions. Say that again. The explosive blonde tensed, his pride suddenly at war with an impulse that had only recently made itself known to him. That new part of himself wanted more than anything to say those words again, to see more of Leg's embarrassed expressions. Conversely, the knee-jerk reaction of his ego firmly stated that such behavior was only for the weak, like the extras he dealt with daily. In the ensuing silence, the massive television mounted into one of the mess hall's walls was finally able to be heard. And that's when it happened. Breaking news. Panic at the Ministry of Justice Wednesday as a defendant was able to acquire a firearm and open fire at the case's groundbreaking witness. Afterward, the accused even took aim at the world-famous final judge herself. The somber announcement made by the single-horned Daikaku Miyagi caused a horrified gasp to ripple through the mess hall. The reputation, fame, and more importantly public admiration of the final judge was thought to be absolute. To even consider a person to have shot at her, it was unthinkable. Thankfully, her honor is unharmed. Now, we were able to acquire footage of the attack, but I feel it my duty to give this warning first. The imagery you are about to see is unsettling. Viewer discretion is highly advised. The television screen cut to black before grainy footage filled the void. Right off the bat, the public of Japan was able to make out the nervous form a plain-faced teenager, the Verdinette standing beside the witness stand where a blue-haired child was fidgeting in. From the distance and resolution of the video, obviously illegally taken, it was hard to determine if the child on the stand was a boyish girl or a feminine boy. Romero? The hated name was mumbled lowly, clearly meant to be unheard. Unfortunately for the blonde bomber, His roommate had excellent hearing. The audience that had gathered by the mess hall's television was struck speechless as the low-quality video began to play, unleashing a scene straight out of a horror movie. Before their very eyes, cruel reality unfolded like the work of some sick fiction as the accused, a woman by all appearances, began to move. Due to the footage's dismal fidelity, to the watching audience it seemed as if one moment everything was normal, the next the accused had smoothly pickpocketed the guard who'd been standing next to her of his gun, weapon in hand. The woman then turned to the young witness on the stand. Without a hint of hesitation, she opened fire. The intensity of the following scene made it hard to watch what happened next. From the edges of the screen, the other courtroom guards were visible, fumbling with their own gun's security straps. Ultimately, they proved useless during the key seconds it took for the madwoman to slaughter the innocent child. Then, in a single breath, the rampage took on another focus. The gun-wielding accused turned the gun towards someone off-screen, presumably the final judge. She pulled the trigger. The green-haired teenager threw himself forward, straight into the path of the gunfire. In a spray of blood, he collapsed. Nearly instantaneously, a previously unseen body jumped into the fray, raven locks whipping through the air as she charged towards the armed madwoman. Before the stunned and horrified audience could even think to brace themselves, the new addition to the chaos had reached their target and savagely ripped her arm off. AR guard. Wham! Many a soul watching the news broadcast flinched as the agonized scream of the accused was cut off as her attacker brutally smashed her own severed limb over her head, with visible hatred burning through glowing red eyes. The beating was harsh and bloody, in no small part due to the gaping wound where the woman's arm used to be attached. The grainy video quivered, as if the recorder had been unable to contain the emotions that had run rampant through their body as they witnessed the carnage before them. Meanwhile, the mess hall was silent as a grave, many patients trying to digest what they'd just seen. Many more wondered why the video hadn't ceased playing yet, showing only the macabre beating as it continued. Wait a minute, is he? The hesitant question died without answer, as everybody still watching the illicit footage across the country took notice of the fact that the verdinette, who'd only just been shot, was moving. Oni-chan. To the ever-deepening horror of those watching, the child witness who they'd just seen murdered only moments ago popped up, looking only marginally nightmarish, doing so while riddled with bullet holes. Rushing to the twitching green-haired teen who'd also been supposedly murdered, the blue-haired child gently laid a hand on his shoulder as he pushed himself to his knees, and then retched a bloody mix of bile and metal, beginning to hate when that happens. The verdinette's words were only faintly audible over the cacophony of shouts from the court guards and screaming from the gallery. But it was clear to anyone able to still watch when the teen stood up, he appeared none the worse for wear. That is, if one could ignore the trail of blood coming from his head that had no visible wound to speak of. Hey, stop that already. Mutterings and murmurs of every nature broke out as the miraculously standing green-haired teen barked a simple command and instantly halted the savage ravinette in her tracks. The enraged young woman visibly switched gears, dashing to the verdinette's side. The video shook and cut to black, the recorder obviously having been jostled too much by the others in the gallery to continue. Daikaku Miyagi returned to the television screen, pale-faced, and only barely suppressing his body's instinctual trembling. That was Romero. Kano asked with a hiss, icy blue eyes wide with fear and shock. The arachnitor had just seen two people shot dead on television, and then they weren't. She couldn't process that information. As all of you tuning in just witnessed, the final judge was targeted but saved due to the intervention of a citizen. However, while the efforts of the young man in question were without a doubt heroic, demands have already been made for his immediate detainment due to the nature of his quirk being called too dangerous. Mr. Miyagi spoke calmly, despite his appearance. The man's somber attitude made it abundantly clear to faithful viewers that there was more to be said. Instead of immediately starting, the man took a moment to gather himself further, shuffling the papers on his desk mechanically. Bakugo didn't need some middle-aged old fart to tell him anymore, though. He'd already known of the existence of the monster they'd all just witnessed. It sickened the blonde bomber that the abominable freak had somehow weaseled his way into gaining license to raise another walking corpse. And this one had been a child, for fuck's sake. Finally, Mr. Miyagi ceased to fidget and stared directly into the camera. The nation stared back. According to reports, and our own station's investigation, it appears there are many facts about Izuku Midoriya that should raise concerns. For example, his quirk was recently reclassified as Cursed Blood. Sinister name aside, actual recorded capabilities were said to include. The report cut off as Mr. Miyagi suddenly sat up straighter, a look of confusion crossing his lined face as he put a hand up to his right ear. The calm facade the aged newscaster had only just recovered slowly broke as concern and frustration began to overtake him. What do you mean we're being taken off the air? We haven't done anything. The station went dark. A moment later, a commercial for all-natural melatonin came on. Those watching could only blink in shock. One of Japan's most known newscasters had just been shut down completely by the government. And in mere moments. Although, many weren't actually too surprised once they thought about it. While airing images and video of the final judge had never been officially outlawed, unless given authorization, such actions had historically been heavily penalized. So, if that really was the Romero you spoke of, Kano began, catching the startled glare of her roommate. How exactly do you intend to bring him down for what he did to you? The Arachnitor's question was in no way sardonic in nature. The Sylvette truly wished to hear her roommate's plan of attack. She couldn't fathom how anyone could hope to defeat someone that defied nature to such an ungodly scale. Bakugo himself could only stare back at his roommate's icy blue eyes in shocked silence. Romero had taken a shot to the head. The blonde had seen it. That meant the freak had died. Except, he hadn't, or if he had, he didn't stay dead. That bullet had done lethal damage, dealt to a part of the human body so vital a single scratch could render even the strongest heroes crippled. And Romero had just taken it and stood right back up. How? Bakugo felt the uncomfortable fingers of uncertainty attempting to curl their way up his spine. He'd learned the hard way that taking down his monstrous nemesis without consequences would be no easy task. At the moment, the blonde could only think of one way to do so without the freak's manipulations getting in the way. The two of them had to be standing on opposite sides. Since he had no plans to ever turn villain, that meant Romero would have to do so. But as much as Bakugo hated to admit it, he knew the freak wouldn't ever admit to his true nature by choice or be held accountable for the things he'd done. Not without a fight. And now the blonde's head was beginning to hurt. But the bomber wasn't the only one in pain at the moment. Redacted, Aizawa residence. Sprawled out on his old, torn-up couch, Shoyuta Aizawa could only suffer and wince as he went through another wave of what could only be described as the most extremely acute case of hangover known to man mixed with severe withdrawal. What was worse was that he knew the exact cause of his current torment and couldn't find it in himself to hate it. At long last, the miraculous blood that had saved him from the brink of death fixed his body to its peak condition and given him more energy than he'd known what to do with was dying out inside him. Even so, that didn't stop the nigh sentient quirk from filling him with the overwhelming desire to go and assist his problem child of a student as soon as the news broadcast he'd been watching had cut out. Gotta help. Aizawa slurred, his entire body protesting as he tried to push off the couch. Incidentally, the gruff man managed to accomplish only half of his endeavor, end up falling to the floor as soon as his center of mass left the cushions he'd been resting on. Ugh. It was only as now that Aizawa cursed his past stupidity regarding his diet during the last few days. He'd known that he'd had to be able to get up and ready to go soon. But at the same time, he'd been afraid of giving in to the mental itch that had cropped up in his thoughts lately regarding obtaining more of his problem child's blood, regardless of whether he needed it or not. In the end, he'd allowed himself to wind up as he was now to avoid falling to the temptation. Thankfully, as his withdrawal progressed, the itch for Midoriya's blood seemed to be lessening. He still wished he could reach out and help the young necromancer, though, and offer any aid he could. Unfortunately, said necromancer was undergoing far more difficult tribulations than his homeroom teacher knew. Same time, Mizudafu General Hospital. Where is Inko Midoriya? The panicked shout might have startled the receptionist at Mizudafu's largest medical center. Had the experienced woman not foreseen such an entrance by the woman in question's son the moment she'd been rushed in. 39 years had given her plenty of acumen when it came to her hospital's patients and their families. What she hadn't expected was for the teenager to be followed by three girls, each with vastly different hair colors. Izuku Midoriya had been spending his last day as an intern at Mizudafu's police station, learning a few of the less intensive skills of the peacekeepers he'd so far been unable to make time for. Gathering forensic evidence and memorizing the steps taken to preserve a crime scene had seemed like well-deserved cake after the fiasco 2 days prior. When all had been said and done, he'd been awarded 2 medals after the trial. The first was to commemorate his service to the country of Japan for his part in taking down the notorious Trinity Raven, her capture leading to the identification of over 24 of the assassin's contractors. The second was presented to him for protecting the final judge without regard for his own life. The green-haired teen had had no way of knowing what was being announced during a certain news broadcast right at that moment. The basement of the station hadn't had a working television in over a decade. By the same measure, he had no way of knowing that his own mother would be watching said news broadcast. It had been well into noontime before he'd get released from his lessons and leave the station's basement, his phone instantly blaring as it finally re-established signal. "Where is Inkyo Midoriya?" Izuku shouted again, looking around frantically in utter desperation. Wild emotions ruined any chance the hero in training had at remaining calm or thinking rationally. Baru hadn't said much when her call had finally made its way through to him. All the green-haired teen knew was that his mother had been working at the Azui household, even though it had been both matriarchs' days off. Apparently, the mothers had been chatting over a cup of tea when the news report came on. Both women had been horrified at the gruesome footage of their favorite green-haired boy being mercilessly shot in the head. As it turned out, it had been too much for Inko to take, too much for her heart to stand. "Calm down, boss." Saki tried to sound fierce, but the rebellious zombie girl could tell through her link to the Verdinet that his despair was nigh all-consuming. The blonde's attempt might have had more effect if her own voice hadn't wobbled pitifully as she spoke. The welling emotion, an unforeseen side effect of learning what having a real mother was like only for her to be put in life-threatening danger soon afterwards. "Izuku-kun," Baru called out as the frog woman came into the green-haired teen's vision. "There you are, Karo." In less than 10 minutes, the situation was explained to a breaking Izuku. For 10 agonizing minutes, the hero in training had to listen to how his mother had suffered first a panic attack and then collapsed. It took every one of those 10 minutes for Izuku to fully comprehend that his mother, the larger-than-life woman who'd loved him and been there for him since the day he was born, was now barely clinging to life. Inko Midoriya had suffered a severe heart attack. The years of watching helplessly as her baby boy suffered the daily trauma of being bullied had finally caught up to the Midoriya matriarch, the media airing his partial murder for its sensationalism the straw to the camel's back. The green-haired mother had bottled her emotions for so long, it had become almost second nature for her to repress herself until it was too late. Incidentally, the medical staff had shortly been able to draw a correlation between Inko's condition and her quirk's recent and sudden spikes in power. Unfortunately, no one had ever stopped to consider how her ability might impact her body, a dire oversight what with quirks historically being likened to a person's muscle. Now, they were all paying the price. For Baru Ajui's part, her conscience weighed her down doubly so. The frog woman had known what had transpired that day in the courtroom. In an effort to spare her new friend and fellow mother the distress she herself had felt when she'd been briefed, she'd decided to withhold the knowledge from Inko. The imposing woman's eldest daughter, on the other hand, was a particular kind of frustrated at the moment. With her father at work and her mother having taken her boyfriend's mother to the hospital, Tiu Ajui had been left at her home to care for Samidare and Satsuki. That didn't stop the frog girl from swearing to herself that she'd chew both her Izukuin and mother out for hiding the events of the courtroom from her as soon as she could. I need to use the restroom," Izuku suddenly announced, unable to remain seated by the small group that had coalesced around him in the hospital's waiting room. The presence of his girlfriend's guilt-ridden mother and 3 zombie girls made the Verdinet abruptly feel claustrophobic. None spoke out to stop him. None questioned him. It was clear to all that the teen needed to release the emotions that were roiling inside of him. Personally, the hero in training wanted to get as much crying out of the way right then as possible so as not to worry his mother any further when she woke up. As the Verdinet left the room, only Tay accompanied him out of those present. Baru felt that both wasn't her place, and she had no right to. Lily felt through the bond that there was nothing she could do for her big brother at the moment. Saki knew that her new boss wouldn't want someone standing there to watch him bawl his eyes out. Not to mention, she was shit at sentimental crap anyway. Mizutafu General Hospital, restroom. In the otherwise empty chamber of porcelain thrones, Izuku repeatedly splashed the coldest water the sink in front of him could dispense onto his face. If he held his breath, the green-haired teen could almost fool himself into believing the droplets that trailed down his cheeks were the frigid spawn of the streaming faucet. Guilt gnawed at him, chipping away at his soul from all fronts. It taunted him with his mother's condition, spitefully decrying his every heroic effort in the name of justice, as culminating in just more suffering for his beloved family. It criticized his stupidity for being unable to think quickly enough to act differently. It decried his stubbornness, painting his acceptance that he'd do it all again regardless of the knowledge of what would come after, as selfish. And when he even tried to consider what would have happened if he hadn't acted at all, it called him a coward, a fake hero. The worst part was that Izuku knew what would happen now, his accelerated thoughts having churned through scenarios since the day of the trial. He would be branded for what happened. Sure, he protected the final judge, but that would account for beans when it came to light that Tay and Lily were undead under his control. Varying levels of autonomy aside, he'd be prosecuted as a slaver, the addition of Saki no doubt worsening that outcome's severity. In the end, while the broadcast had been cut short, the Vertinet knew that the report would be leaked to the public soon enough, if it hadn't been already. And now he'd be blamed for his mother's health as well. Which was only fair, her condition was his fault. What should I do? The empty bathroom hardly carried the question's echo, but the words hadn't been meant for anyone in particular. Izuku knew something had to be done, but the what eluded him. He couldn't focus. Too much of his brain's power was being spent on worrying about his mother. The hero in training couldn't even think up possible options to choose from on how to proceed. Why couldn't he think of an ANS? Heal. Her. W what? Izuku's shocked scream was an entire 2 octaves higher than his previous record. The Vertinet could have cared less at that moment. His heart pounded. Besides Tay's stalwart presence, he should have been alone. Heal. Her. The words repeating allowed Izuku to recognize their source, and when he did, horror unlike anything he'd ever experienced before flooded his system, clutching him in an icy grip. The words were said in his voice. That wasn't quite right, though. It was as if it both was and wasn't him. The words had carried with no emotion, only cold logic, directly to him. In fact, had he really heard anything at all, or had he merely felt the impression of the words in his mind? Wide-eyed, Izuku jerked back upright, hoping to use the reflection of the mirror to see if anyone had snuck in without him noticing. Instantly, the green-haired teen felt his breath catch in his throat. His eyes were glowing. Staring back at Izuku from the mirror was an image of himself, but not. A shining vermilion gaze he'd never seen before bore into him. Impossible to read. Who are you? Izuku asked, subtly positioning himself into the beginnings of a defensive stance. With his current problems, the Vertinet refused to even hazard a guess as to what to expect from this development. Better to be prepared. I am. Thou art. I. The him with the burning gaze stared back, the words crashing against Izuku's brain like tumbling boulders. The green-haired heroine, training felt a weight come crushing down upon him as he came to a heart-stopping realization. The him that wasn't gave a shallow nod, still unblinking. Izuku swallowed heavily. This figure, this phantasm, it could have only been one thing. He'd first felt it during the attack on the USJ, when he'd been unable to act. It had taken the reins then, and pushed him past his limits. There was no doubt in his mind. This was that sinister force that lived inside him. He was talking to his quirk, his own cursed blood. What do you want? Izuku asked, abruptly feeling a rod of steel insert itself into his back. If he was going to face the force of nature that had upturned his entire life and made his existence a struggle by its very definition, then he was going to face it head-on. He refused to cower in this moment. A million thoughts and ideas ran through the Vertinet's mind as he waited for an answer. While rare, sentient quirks had been recorded since the dawn of the New Age, and mixed into those accounts laid a number of nightmarish tales of parasitic ones that evidently overwrote the will of their host. Izuku suppressed a shudder when another realization came upon him. His blood could demand anything from him. It wasn't like he could easily refuse. Briefly, the terrifying thought that the microorganisms he harbored wished to spread themselves across the entire world entered his head. What is thy desire? That was not what Izuku had expected. Of all the demands, of all the possibilities, it had to be the most baffling of them all that confronted him. Did this mean his quirk was safe? Had he truly just been overthinking the repercussions of using his blood and casting it as sinister in ignorance? Did he actually have a misunderstood blessing flowing through his veins? It couldn't be that simple, could it? Can you fully restore my mother to full health? Izuku asked, hesitating once before adding, without control affecting her at all. It had been devastating when the green-haired teen had realized Tsuchan had accidentally fallen under his blood sway. Life during the interim, until the frog girl had flushed his quirk from her system, had been an experience he never wanted to live through again. That was actually the reason Izuku had consciously avoided contact with Aizawa-sensei recently. Staying out of his homeroom teacher's presence would hopefully prevent the gruff man from suffering his blood's enthralling effects too harshly. But even the mere thought of enslaving his mother? It was almost too much to bear. There was another pause, as the reflection of the Verdinette's quirk once again only stared at its host. Izuku felt his entire body tense in preparation for a worst-case answer. Perhaps he really couldn't use his blood without its curse? Yes. Izuku almost collapsed against the sink he'd come to grip almost unconsciously. A wave of trepidation and confusion suddenly flooded him instead of the relief he'd expected. If this reflection was to be believed, then it set off numerous questions about the nature of his accursed quirk. If he could save his mother, and who knew how many others, from life-threatening injuries or conditions without enslaving them, then why hadn't that been the case until now? The revelation that it might be a choice was so mind-blowing that Izuku almost slipped into shock. Up until that moment, he'd always held a dark theory that his blood's healing effect on others was only a byproduct, a result of the quirk's almost sentient desire to supply him, or itself, with more useful tools. However, that had always run counter to his own wish to simply helping others. The dichotomy had always been a frustrating aspect of his curse. But now it was plainly clear to see the answer that had always eluded him. The true nature of his quirk was terrifyingly simple. For all its possible intelligence, for all its seemingly villainous intentions, his blood obeyed him above all else. So what did the enslavement of Tsuchan and Aizawa-sensei say about him? It was a thought that deepened a pit in Izuku's stomach that he'd always tried to ignore. But now that pit had become an encroaching abyss that threatened to. Aizuan-ai. Lily's muffled voice snapped Izuku out of his spiraling musings. Inko-mama can get visits now. The green-haired teen nodded before realizing the littlest zombie girl couldn't see his response from outside the bathroom. Taking one last moment to himself, Izuku turned to look at his quirk's reflection one last time. The unsettling vermilion hadn't blinked once, and continued to stare back at him with the seriousness of the grave. A gentle, supportive hand slipped onto Izuku's shoulder, breaking the contest of wills. Tay gave a slow nod and grunt when her master turned to look at her. The hero in training didn't need their bond to understand the message. The Ravenette had somehow been aware of the situation, and she'd just given him her vote of confidence. It felt nice. Mizuta-fu General Hospital, Intensive Care Ward, Room 302. Inko Midoriya was not exaggerating when she said she was having a truly terrible day. Only hours ago, the event she'd long feared had come to pass. She'd had to witness her baby boy being murdered before her very eyes. The fact that her son could shake off death like a dirty pair of clothes ultimately mattered little to her. The green-haired mother was of the firm belief that no parent should be forced to endure such a horrible sight. Just seeing her baby suffering, imaging the pain he'd felt when that bullet had struck his skull, it made her nauseous to even remember. And on top of that, Inko had no idea of whether or not her son's quirk could completely heal the brain, complicated organ that it was. What if Izuku had lost parts of his memory, or his personality? What if? Mom. The tentative call, quite enough to almost wither away in the air, was still enough to give the internally panicking mother the strength to focus herself. Inko's tired gaze was gratefully met with the sight of her precious baby boy as he entered her room. He looked to be in perfect health as always, standing tall, and more importantly in one piece. More importantly, with his beautiful emerald eyes shimmering with unshed tears and his voice trembling with guilt as it was, the green-haired mother was put at ease that her baby was still himself after his latest ordeal. I'm so sorry, Mom," Izuku whispered, steps faltering as he closed the distance between the two and took his mother's hand. "I know I promised to never do it again, and I know I kept it a secret, but I just can't help it. I can't stand there and not try to save someone in need." Guilt of her own flooded Inko as she heard her son's heartfelt confession. She was sure of it now, a nagging fear that had only grown louder recently. Her fretting and overprotectiveness, her own insecurities, were only causing her baby more hurt. The green-haired mother had known better than anyone of her Izuku's heroic nature, just how selfless he was. Trying to keep him from acting on that very nature had been terrible of her, regardless of the fact that her intention had been to protect him from preying villains. The events of the trial highlighted the cruelty of reality for her. She couldn't be selfish any longer. As much as it pained her to admit, she couldn't hinder her baby's involvement and growth from here on out. Instead, she would have to fully accept his choices and support him on his quest to become one of the greatest heroes. That's why, Izuku continued, tears finally cascading down his freckled cheeks. A watery smile beamed at Inko. "That's exactly why I can't just stand here now and do nothing when I could be doing something to save you." Inko blinked rapidly, wrestling her remaining fatigue down as she fought to understand her son's words. As her mental fog dissipated, her doctor's words returned to her in a kaleidoscope of fragmented memories that boiled down to one finality. Until a compatible heart was found, her existence was reliant on the life support machines surrounding her. And even then, the surgery to implant the replacement organ was risky for someone at her age and condition. On top of those factors, even a successful transplant would necessitate therapy and medication that would remain daunting shadows over her future for the rest of her life. The green-haired woman also knew she'd need constant attention during her initial recovery. Attention that her son would selflessly volunteer, she was sure, even though that would sacrifice his dream to be a hero in the process. And that was unacceptable. Inko refused to cut the wings of her baby. She would rather. "Mom, I can heal you," Izuku announced, temporarily solid in determination before hesitancy at the idea returned. "But only if you allow me. If you trust me." Inko felt her battered heart swell. She understood, of course she did. How could she forget that her baby was closer to an angel than anyone gave him credit for? Izuku could perform miracles with his quirk, even if there were concerning side effects. And how could she not trust her own son? "Do it," Inko rasped, the act of speaking sapping her of what strength she'd recovered since waking. "I believe in you, Izuku." With consent given, the door to Inko's room swung open, revealing her son's 3 undead charges. The trio entered wordlessly, Saki and Tae positioning themselves to stand guard to prevent interruption, while Lily solemnly presented Izuku with the medkit once again. While dressing the girls in their hero costumes had been a spur-of-the-moment decision originally, the green-haired teen was grateful for his fortunate choice. Though Saki still lacked her own, the others wearing theirs meant Lily had had easy access to the tools he'd need to save his mother. Standing over his mother, syringe in hand, Izuku considered how to begin. His normal chant felt inadequate for what he wished to accomplish. There was also his blood's words to consider. According to the reflection, his quirk submitted to his wishes completely. So that presented the question, how did he go about communicating his desire precisely enough so that his mother didn't become entrapped by control but was still completely healed? After a somber moment of silence, and tens of ideas considered and discarded, Izuku believed he'd finally stitched together a compelling directive. "O you who gifted me with life," Izuku began, tone descending into the level he'd used when chanting previously. At the edges of his consciousness, the green-haired teen felt a twitch shiver throughout his entire being. He hoped that the feeling was his blood coming to attention and heeding his words. "Who built my strength and hope through strife. Of one body, mind, and soul, I swear to you this chosen goal. In this hour, your time of need, I offer you this blessed creed. Freely do I my blood impart, to freely mend your tired heart." Inko hardly reacted at all when Izuku stuck himself with the empty syringe, extracting the needed amount of blood. The green-haired woman's entire focus was on her baby. How solemn and melancholic he appeared even as he worked to perform a miracle. Likewise, the homely woman barely felt it when her son injected her with the syringe's contents. It was an odd feeling, knowing her child's blood was flowing through her veins at that moment, traveling to her heart to repair life-threatening damage. It didn't feel unnatural at all, and no invasive sensation set her on edge like she might have expected. Instead, Inko felt strangely at peace. While the immediate fallout of the trial's illicit footage had now been handled, Izuku was unfortunately completely unaware of the unintended audience he'd procured. In the shadows, figuratively and literally, many an interested party was even at that moment examining the surprising oddity that was Izuku Midoriya. And as the video ended over and over again, many observers came to the same conclusion. Izuku Midoriya was a prize indeed. And soon enough, one way or another, his quirk, his very genetic makeup, would be theirs. Redacted bar. Sequestered far from any searching eyes, the only two combatants who'd managed to escape the failed assault on UA's USJ facility could only stare at their ancient television set as they tried to digest the gruesome scene they'd just witnessed. The first to gather themselves immediately shot to his feet, the stool he'd been sitting on clattering to the ground. That's the brat who. But how? The lanky man, currently only wearing a single hand over his face, could hardly formulate a coherent sentence. His lithe body shook, a sign of his disintegrating self-control. The little shit that had blasted his face with a gun of all things had just stood up, in clear view for all to see, after being shot in the head while playing hero. The only reasonable conclusion the pale-haired young man could conceive of was that the brat had somehow found a way to use fucking cheat codes. But that didn't explain that monster of a girl who'd backed him up. How brutal, commented the bartender, and only other occupant of the establishment. The acidic yellow lights that functioned as eyes for the man whose body was otherwise a roiling black fog in a suit couldn't look away from the utterly savage beating the ravinette in question was giving the accused. And with her own severed arm no less. There is no possible way that woman survived such egregious injuries. When the video ended, their own recording of the original broadcast, the entire sequence of events was still burned into their minds. The younger of the two men suddenly slammed a fist onto the bar, rattling glassware. A wild look could be seen between the fingers of the hand covering his face. He'd just had a revelation. That's it, the lanky villain hoarsely screamed. That little shit must have been an S-level healer the whole fucking time. No wonder he could fuck up our operation like that. The man's compatriot internally hated moments like these, when his leader would equate everything to his video games. The boy needed to take these matters seriously. However, even the mist-based villain had to admit there was some validity to the analogy. A healing quirk of such stature could explain many of the inconsistencies they'd witnessed at the USJ, from Eraserhead's confounding and instantaneous recovery to the survival of the savage black-haired girl who'd been broken by Nomo. It would even rationalize the impossibility of someone being unaffected by his leader's own devastating quirk. And while a bullet to the head was normally fatal to even the greatest of natural regenerators, apparently the child in question possessed a quirk far stronger than any other ever recorded. The implications were endless. If that is true, a sinister voice rose from a static-filled monitor to the side of the bar. Audio only, the only words discernible over the chaotic screen. Then the heroes certainly shouldn't be allowed the honor of having him. The two villains in the room instantly snapped to attention, giving the monitor their complete focus. Sensei, the lanky villain began, slightly wary. What should we do about him then? For half a minute, silence reigned throughout the bar. Neither villain dared to speak again before the voice from the monitor had a chance to answer. For now, research, the voice commanded, though the words were no more harshly spoken than a suggestion. The days to come will be hell on earth for that poor boy, I assure you. Let us ensure that, when the time is right, he is given the proper options to confront the public outcry that will soon dog his every step. The lanky villain grinned like a madman, his lips pulling hard enough to slip from underneath the hand covering his face. The prospect of adding such a powerful healer to his party made him excited. Conversely, The bartender gave no outward sign of a reaction. The elder villain, knowing what the owner of the voice from the monitor was actually thinking at the moment. He was wary. A quirk as powerful as they'd just witnessed shouldn't have escaped his notice for so long. Historically, those with powers that could prove useful were ferreted out and brought to his attention before those who wielded them even reached their 10th birthday. And yet, somehow this boy had been a complete unknown. That meant one of two things. Either a third party was working to hide information from them, or the boy's quirk had started off much weaker and had actually evolved to the point it was currently at. Both possibilities were concerning. Shizuoka Prefecture, the Todoroki household. Shoto Todoroki had been having what passed as a family lunch. Only his sister Fuyumi and bastard of a father present. As usual, between himself, the soft-spoken teacher, and the flame hero, there hadn't been much to talk about, so it had been silently agreed upon by the dysfunctional family to turn on the television. Immediately the news had blared on, delivering a breaking report about a certain green-haired necromancer protecting the final judge from life-threatening injuries. How did he do that? Fuyumi asked in utter shock. Just like everyone else who'd watched the illicitly taken video, she'd seen plain as day the Verdunette survive a bullet to the head like it was nothing. Endeavor mulled over what he'd just seen in stalwart silence. He'd seen an untold amount of quirks over the years as a pro hero, and while others might not know it, abilities that could allow for the survival of such attacks weren't as uncommon as the public thought. However, those same abilities usually included noticeable activation or body modification, neither of which the green-haired runt on the television had displayed. Curious. I didn't think Midoriya's regeneration extended to brain damage. Shoto murmured to himself without thinking. Truthfully, the heterochromatic had been so focused on the video that he'd forgotten his sister and bastard father were still in the room. They, unfortunately, hadn't forgotten him. Wait! Fuyumi shouted, whipping around to face her little brother. You know him? Quietly, Endeavor went back to eating his meal, covertly listening in to his children's conversation. The brusque man, interested as he was, knew that if he attempted to ask his own questions, his rebellious son would clam up out of spite. Shoto hummed, still too engrossed in his own thoughts to consider his words. Oh, he's my classmate. Flicking his eyes to his sister, the heterochromatic belatedly realized the young woman wouldn't be satisfied by his short answer. Sighing, the dual-colored teen launched into the exploits of the young necromancer that he knew of, once again overlooking who else was present. Forgotten, Endeavor allowed his smile to turn wicked. He can do all that, Fuyumi exclaimed. The young teacher was amazed that someone with that kind of power hadn't turned to villainy by now. She was sure she wouldn't know the first thing to do with a student like that. She wasn't even sure she was happy about her brother being classmates with the green-haired teen now. This Midoriya sounds most interesting, Endeavor said abruptly, finally speaking. The booming voice of their father startled the conversing children into instant silence. A quirk like that is far too powerful to ignore. At that moment, Shoto Todoroki realized he'd fucked up. Meanwhile, as he stood up from the table, meal finished, Endeavor allowed his thoughts to spin plans for the future. The green-haired boy was something else, a diamond in the rough of the weak masses. Such genetic potential as his should be put to good use immediately, not allowed to squander itself in the foolishness of youth. Walking away from his current masterpiece and first failure, Enji Todoroki contemplated how to proceed. It would have been preferable if this Midoriya had been female. Breeding with Shoto would have no doubt given him a new, even better weapon to unseat All Might with little trouble. But, as things stood, the flame hero supposed his daughter would just have to give birth to a proper candidate for his masterpiece to mate with. Endeavor nodded to himself. Yes, that would be perfect. Then his blood would be in the offspring twice over, and its magnificence would be undeniable. Redacted compound. Cast in silhouette by the television he watched, a lone man studiously took deep breaths to prevent himself from vomiting at what he'd just watched. The scene had been nightmarish, a confirmation of every fear he'd ever had since he was a child. Slowly, the deep breaths worked, and the shaking that had barely been suppressed quieted. Now still, the man took a further moment to center himself. It wouldn't do for his subordinates to see even a hint of weakness on his part. He knew that at least one wouldn't hesitate to take a chance at him if he did. Standing, The man swung his fur-shouldered jacket from the rack it had been placed on and put the garment on. Reaching over to his desk, he grabbed the lone item resting there and put it on as well. Mask in place, the man pulled out his phone with gloved hands. "Chronostasis, meet me in the medical bay immediately," the man said, voice firm and unyielding. There was no trace of the panic that had nearly overtaken him only moments ago. "The quirk disease has evolved. I just witnessed it bring an infected back to life. We need to step up our plans." The man took a single step forward before halting, a thought crossing his mind. "And remember to bring Eri. Mizutafu General Hospital, Intensive Care Ward, Room 302. Izuku Midoriya was unaware of the fact, but at the moment, he was in more trouble than he could ever have imagined. A sinister request. Ichigo No Name, who had only recently officially lost the right to the name Go, realized not for the first time that she was in dire straits. Her despair at witnessing the life she'd earned through blood, sweat, and tears, though not always her own, crumbing before her at the hands of her freakish stepchild, who should have been a rotting corpse, had made her snap. In a fit of insanity, she'd attempted the inconceivable, and thanks to her longtime employer's generous covert training, she'd nearly succeeded. The woman hadn't known there was a monster in the courtroom, however, and that single mistake had cost her everything all over again. It wasn't fair. She'd worked for everything she'd ever had in her shitty life, ever since the week before she'd turned 4 and her quirk had manifested. Being an emitter type wasn't all it was cracked up to be when your ability was something worthless like unbutton. Her childhood had consisted of broken dreams and pitying glances, snide comments from mean-spirited classmates, and worst of all, disappointment in the eyes of her parents. It wasn't fair. When she'd turned 14, her father had, under the pretense of making her and her waste of a quirk useful, begun to introduce her to men that were appreciative of a quirk such as hers. Ichigo had run out of tears quickly after the first few of these meetings, but it had been at the end of one particular one that she'd had an epiphany. As she'd laid there, still wallowing in shock on top of ruffled sheets and feeling the bruises already forming on her face and stomach, she'd realized that if she didn't want what was happening to her to be her life forever, she'd need to take action. So she had. From that day forward, Ichigo had worked hard to remake herself into the most cunning, devious, and ruthless person she could. She'd played nice with her tormentors in school, winning the brainless cunts over with ease. She'd used her quirk to utterly embarrass rising competition. It turned out having your pants or skirt drop in the middle of class during a speech damaged one's reputation considerably. She'd used and abused anyone she could, however she could, to get what she wanted. She'd played classmates, seduced teachers, allied with like-minded individuals, and even paid lesser gangs to intimidate those who thought to oppose her. Nothing was below her, as she'd already started from the bottom. She'd ruled her middle school. She'd been in the running for queen of her high school. College abroad had been a challenge, but her tenacity and ruthlessness had made her a force to be reckoned with regardless. After graduating, she'd wasted no time in ruining her father, gleefully utilizing the contacts and blackmail she'd gathered over the years to their fullest potential. Throughout her scholastic career, the man had never once stopped scheduling meetings with appreciative men he'd find from who knew where. Ichigo still felt slightly cheated that he'd committed suicide after only the second sexual misconduct scandal. Nevertheless, her reputation had preceded her, and she'd eventually gained the attention of the one who'd come to be her longest-running and most profitable employer. After a rather rigorous, but unquestionably pleasant interview, Ichigo had thought she'd been set for life. It wasn't fair. Now, Ichigo found herself laid out on the bare cot of a hospital bed she'd woken up in as she waited listlessly for today's torturer to arrive. As if being thrown into a maximum security prison wasn't bad enough, now she knew she'd do so with only one functional arm and an altogether ruined body, the one tool that had never failed her before. A flash of pain seared through Ichigo's nerves as her thoughts turned once again to the savage that had accosted her in the courtroom. The crazed ravenette who'd ripped off her arm had done an incredibly thorough job of breaking her. So much so that the twitchy doctor who'd spoken to her after she'd first woken up had estimated that total recovery was nigh impossible now, even so soon after the initial injuries had been sustained. It wasn't fair. According to the quack, The bones of her dismembered arm had been shattered to the point they could never mend properly, making the fact the now useless limb had somehow been reattached that much more bittersweet. Ichigo had also been told the fractures her skull had sustained throughout the attack would continue to ache for the rest of her life, and it was doubtful pain medication would help too much. On top of that, her right eye constantly saw flashes and blurred, exacerbating the migraines that plagued her every waking moment. The woman wondered why the doctors even bothered securing her wrists and ankles to her bed. It wasn't fair. At least there was a laughable silver lining to her situation. According to the shit lawyer that had been appointed as her defense when her employers had failed to show, another hit to Ichigo's ego. There was at least a chance that the brats who'd gotten involved in the courtroom wouldn't be able to press additional charges against her. After all, every one of the little shits had left that room in perfect health. 2 centuries was a long enough sentence anyway. It all irked Ichigo to no end. It wasn't fair. The brats would live without even a single scar to show for their efforts, while she would never fully heal from her injuries and be sent to prison for life. She couldn't even see a way to turn anything around. What could she do? Ask for house arrest? Plead to be sent to a low-security prison's medical ward as a permanent patient? Writing a book about the unfairness of her treatment probably wouldn't go anywhere. Absently, Ichigo registered the door to her room being opened, the officers standing in the hallway guarding her speaking in low tones with whoever had approached. A few brief words were said before the uniformed men allowed the newcomer to enter. By the sound the figure made, whoever it was had brought one of those rickety hospital carts with them today. It wasn't fair. Ichigo couldn't even find the strength to move her head enough to properly get a look at her guest until said person was towering over her. Once her field of vision was filled, "Well, hello there," chirped a voice that was disturbingly attempting to remain some version of feminine. "It's time for your routine cleaning, miss." The person who'd walked into the room made Ichigo simultaneously pale and flush in disgusted rage. It was another one of those cross-dressing freaks, just like her now ex-stepchild. Unlike Takeo's abomination of a son, this man was far too burly, hairy, and overall masculine to ever hope to pass as a woman. Ichigo felt her stomach turn, for once not a symptom of her ever-present migraines. She'd grown to hate people like this man. Takeo's little freak being a leading cause of her current situation and the downfall of her hard-earned life only added fuel to the fire. It wasn't fair. "Today we're going to change your covers too, darling," the cross-dressing nurse announced, still smiling cheerfully. The man held up a tray holding an adjustable leather gag, bandages, and a number of syringes. "You remember the process, right? And don't you worry, I've done this before." The woman in the bed fought to roll her eyes in helpless exasperation. Great. Today's torturer was this freak. Just her luck. Managing a tiny nod, Ichigo flinched as even that minute motion shot pain from her head, down her spine, to her toes. Even speaking hurt. It wasn't fair. By now, Ichigo had realized that getting any better quality medical treatment at the facility she was currently in would be next to impossible. Even her useless, reattached arm looked like a high school student had stuck it back on without any surgical know-how. All things considered, as much as she hated to admit it, at least trained monkeys weren't the ones performing this agonizing and humiliating procedure. "Alrighty, lightly bite into the gag now, please," requested the burly cross-dresser stuffed into a nurse's outfit, raising the wrapped leather tool to Ichigo's mouth. As soon as she bit into it, a fat-lipped grin spread across the man's face. "Now, let's just adjust it right away so it won't fall out or hurt you now." A suppressed grunt of pain sieved through the gag as the abused nerves in Ichigo's neck lit up like a wildfire. The woman was pretty damn sure the beastly thing attending her was being far less gentle than possible. It wasn't fair. A soft knock at the door drew the attention of both Ichigo and the cross-dressing nurse. "Miss, we just received word our shift replacements are going to be late," the officer on the right said with an even voice, clearly recognizing the individual attending his prisoner. "We're thinking of going for a cup of coffee. Will you be all right all alone with the convict for 10 minutes? Ichigo fought to keep her seething emotions from showing themselves. The jab, the sarcasm, none of it escaped her. She could tell when someone was fucking mocking her, damn it. But she couldn't move, couldn't do anything. Her injuries were better restraints than the straps tying her to her bed. It wasn't fair. "Oh, don't you worry about me, sweetheart. The beastly freak shot back, acting like some flustered lady. This is going to take some time anyway. You two could even take a 30-minute break, and I'd still be here when you got back. If she'd been able to speak, Ichigo would have added that a full hour would have been fine too. The less time she spent with the straps on the better. I see. The officer replied, nodding slightly. We'll see what happens then. It shouldn't take that long though. The bear-sized cross-dresser returned to his work, Ichigo watching him as he placed his phone over the monitor tracking her vitals, checked her condition notes, and beyond a doubt, did everything possible to drag out the awful suspense she felt as she waited to be moved. All of her injuries, reattached arm included, without fail caused the next step in her torture to make her scream. The gag had been added after the first time. It wasn't fair. Finally, the cross-dresser finished the normal cleaning procedures. The time had come for her broken body to be moved. Ichigo could already feel her nerves firing, anticipating the coming agony. Now then, let's take this away for a bit, the cross-dresser said, taking the emergency button from Ichigo. And say, you don't mind if I play a video while we do this, do you? It has music. The question was ludicrous, but Ichigo only allowed her eyes to finally roll in their battered sockets in answer. Having background noise to cover her screams was probably allowed by now. No one wanted to deal with a criminal like her. So who knows what they promised the freak currently taking care of her to get him down here. It wasn't fair. Oh, you're going to love it. The cross-dresser gushed, whipping out a small data stick from his pocket and plugging it into the television that had been mounted over a corner of the room. The man unmuted the device as the video began to load. This idol is my favorite ever. She made my life so much brighter. Ichigo could have cared less, but then the screen began to play. A spotlight snapped on, and a small girl with twin tails of sky blue was revealed. The girl smiled widely and began her routine, addressing the audience with a cheerful attitude and adorable demeanor. Everything the little idol said spread a message of love freely given and self-acceptance, decrying the restraints people placed on both due to gender. Ichigo's blood ran cold. It was Takeo's freak of a son on the screen. It wasn't fair. You know, the burly cross-dresser drawled, attitude changing as his words slipped into a somber tone. It broke my heart when I heard that such an adorable little munchkin had suffered such a terrible fate. At that moment, Ichigo knew she was in more trouble than she ever had been in before. She knew this had been a possibility too, that once Masao and Lily were connected as being one and the same, someone might come after her to take revenge for her part in the child's death. And now, here she was, bound and gagged without even an emergency call button to call for help. It wasn't fair. I think if she'd told me to stop being a villain, I might have even done it. Who knows? I might have even become a heroine instead. The burly cross-dresser mused, and Ichigo felt her stomach clench, finally recognizing the face of the one who'd been caring for her. Oh well, I guess some things just aren't meant to be, huh? Ichigo trembled. There was no mistaking it. She'd never seen this villain without sunglasses before, but there was no doubt left in her mind now. Kind of like finding a handsome man who doesn't judge a woman on her physical appearance. The villain in disguise growled, a baseball bat adorned with rusty nails appearing from the shadows. Or, you living another day. Ichigo forced down an instinctive need to vomit. She was stuck in the same room as the villain known as Magna, and there was no way out. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. Thanks to you, my dear Lily-chan was forced to learn all about the horrors that crawl in this society's shadows firsthand, Magnus said, slowly approaching the broken form of Ichigo. Tears now streamed down the woman's cheeks, and she shook fruitlessly against the bindings that held her. Thanks to you, those degenerates who dare call themselves men were allowed to defile the purest light this world had to offer. Magna ripped away whatever covering remained on Ichigo, the woman whimpering through the gag in her mouth, as even such jostling as that caused pain to flare throughout her body. The cross-dressing villain grinned. I think it's only fair someone teach you what pain like that really feel like, Magnus said. And I think the lesson should take its sweet time so that you never forget it. It wasn't fair. 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 It wasn't. It It would be just the luck of one Ichigo no-name that the officers supposedly guarding her actually did end up taking an hour-long break, their shift replacements never bothering to show. It was an additional stroke of bad luck that no one cared to check on her either until late the next day. Monday, UA High School front gate. A nondescript black SUV pulled into a curbside parking spot just shy of a block from Japan's top hero school in the east, its back doors smoothly popping open as soon as all motion had ceased. With as much confidence as he could muster, Izuku Midoriya exited the vehicle as quickly as possible, holding a hand out for the next egressing passenger. Almost immediately, the Verdunette's hand was caught, and Tsuyu Azui made her own departure into the world. In a much less impressive manner, Izuku's three undead partners tumbled out of the SUV in a tangle of flailing limbs and biting teeth. Sighing at the sight of Tay gnawing on Saki's forearm while the blonde delinquent pulled on Lily's pigtails, the young hero in training could only silently thank the powers that be that school had finally started back up. It would be a gratifying change of pace after the turmoil his life had been thrown into over the last few days. After the news broadcast had ousted one of his quirk's most daunting abilities, and the public had gotten an eyeful of what he could do, the media hadn't stopped there. The entire weekend had been full of reporters and journalists at all levels baying for interviews, answers, and even more concerning, further demonstrations. On top of that, Izuku had had to deal with being grounded the entire time. Inko Midoriya making her displeasure at her son's reckless actions known quite clearly over an hour-long lecture. While he'd never admit it, the Verdunette had loved every minute of it, his mother acting completely normal, continuing to lighten a weight that had sat on his soul for a long time. Of course, the grounding hadn't helped in placating his Tsuchan, oh no. The beautiful and rightfully angry amphibian teen that Izuku had the privilege to call his girlfriend had extracted her pound of flesh in the form of a binding promise to never do something so thoughtless again, a massage, and lots of cuddles. That had been a brief reprieve. Izuku sighed again, mind turning back to just that morning, when the day had began as bad as it possibly could have. When he, his partners, and his mother had attempted to leave their home earlier than normal so to avoid the circus outside their door, they'd found the performers had anticipated their plan. The flight to the Azui household had nearly turned bloody, and Izuku was certain Saki had taken potshots at a few of the more overzealous reporters more than once. Thankfully, the grounds of his wonderful girlfriend's home were forbidden land to any news correspondent who enjoyed living. In crossing the threshold under Baru's watchful eye had earned the hard-pressed family a welcome respite. After half an hour of peace, Gamma had volunteered, for good or ill, to be the one to give his daughter, and the teen with the cursed blood, a ride to school. One awkward trip later, and here they were. Holy fucking shit. Saki suddenly exclaimed as she took in the sight of UA's massive gates, the blonde's fear and awe clear to see in her wide-eyed gaze. You really study here? A moment of silence took the slow-moving group, the two living party members blinking at the delinquent's shock. Tay rolled her head to the side, dead maroon eyes catching bewildered Ruby. Gongya? The simple groan somehow managed to convey equal parts honest questioning and mirthful taunting. Lily's head quickly bounced back and forth, eagerly nodding along in agreement to the sentiment. The littlest zombie's rose-colored irises shone with glee. Lily's pretty sure we already told Blondie this too. The brunette agreed, chiming in with a bright smile at the sight of the now sputtering delinquent. Flailing for some excuse that would help her save face, Saki abandoned the notion after a moment of thought and huffed, crossing her arms in indignation. The action only caused the others in the group to grin further, and in one case, groan again. You said best hero school ever. The blonde attempted to growl, but the usual aggression in her tone was still cowed by the sight of the institution before her. That could have meant any two-bit school in Japan for all I knew. Unfortunately for the undead delinquent, there was no better hero school than UA. Sticking her nose up at her new comrades, Saki continued walking forward with as much dignity as she could retain. As she strode forward, the blonde zombie girl finally had to admit it to herself. Her new boss was the definition of badass. She'd heard of his heroic attitude and witnessed it the day of the court clusterfuck, but this? Even as she stepped ever closer, The idea that a hero school like UA of all places had accepted the Verdinet blew her mind. Her boss's quirk, his individuality, it wasn't pretty. It wasn't combative or flashy in the traditional sense, and more importantly, it easily fell within the darker spectrum of powers. Saki had learned at a young age how quick their shitty society was to label its people based on abilities they had no choice in wielding, for better or, more oftentimes, for worse. Those with weak quirks were looked down on, sure, but those with quirks that involved conventionally dark themes were almost always regarded as villains in the making, regardless of the person's actual personality or actions. The fact that a world-famous hero school like UA had accepted her boss in spite of this was mind-blowing. Unbelievable. Well, if you want to stick around, you'll have to attend with me, Izuku reminded, waving at Gunma as he pulled away and headed to work. Otherwise, you're free to wait at home until your time is over. Kindly spoken, the words weren't a threat in any way, not by any stretch of the imagination. The green-haired teen was comfortable with the idea of the blonde joining his group at this point, especially considering who her father was and how effective she'd shown herself to be in combat. However, that didn't mean he was going to force her to join a path she didn't wish to walk down. Freedom of choice worked both ways, damn it. I'm sure Taechan would be more than happy to speed things up for you, Karo. Kyu added as she slipped her arms around Izuka's left side, slightly leaning against her boyfriend as she did so. The action was almost instinctive for the frog girl after everything that the two had been through already. Isn't that right? Tae groaned in agreement as she shuffled forward and quickly slid to her master's right side, shadowing him like a bodyguard. Not to be left out, Lily buzzed forward childishly and took Izuku's free hand for her own as the four walked by the stunned blonde. What do you mean, of course, you useless fucking bag of skin and bones? Saki roared, outraged at the boldly unspoken affirmation of her undead sister. You can't even articulate a single goddamn word. As she tore after her boss, his girl, and her fellow zombie girls, Saki wondered to herself what kind of people could possibly attend the same school as the teen that had changed her world. Surely the students of such a famous school were as badass as her boss, right? Later, UA High School, 1A homeroom. They were not. Izuku-kun. Hyukujiro was, unsurprisingly enough, the first to approach the budding necromancer as soon as he and his entourage had entered their classroom. Shadowing the rocker girl, quite literally, was the raven-headed Fumikage Tokoimi. Both members of the gothic rock duo held looks of deep concern for their mutual friend. Are you alright? For once, Saki didn't scoff. The blonde refused to fault brats who showed concern for her boss. In a way, they reminded her of her old gang, always looking out for their leader. My friend, Fumikage began solemnly, unaware of how far Izuku had gone in an attempt to downplay his survival. Victory aside, the sheer severity of your injury no doubt left you with terrible scarring, of the soul, if not the flesh. Please, if you ever find yourself in need, call upon us, and we will be there. Okay, that was a bit much for the delinquent girl, but if her boss could act like a cinnamon roll most of the time and still be such a badass when it mattered, perhaps the overly dramatic bird for brains could be tougher than he'd just sounded. Saki refused to judge the gathering crowd on looks alone. They had to have amazing powers to be in one of the hero classes of Japan's top hero school. That, or they had balls of steel. Lily-chan. The cry hardly finished before Momoyeruzu glomped the littlest zombie in a ferocious hug, the sight more than a little creepy in Saki's opinion. I'm sorry for not being there to protect you. Saki would judge the actions of these heroes in training, though. Truly badass friends would be subtle with their worry, congratulating her boss for his battle prowess first before obliquely mentioning after any health problems. At least Bird for Brains had been somewhat salvageable, unlike the majority of the brats who'd settled for just swarming her boss with dumbass looks of concern or pity. Would you all just stop? Seiu's abrupt request carried the sharp tone of command. You're crowding MY boyfriend, and he's not here for your entertainment, Karo. Saki allowed the savage grin that crept across her face, acknowledging the frog girl as a perfect example of what a badass girlfriend was supposed to be like. Tiu worried about Izuku. It was plain to see on her normally expressionless face, but she was able to handle the boss's badassery like no other. The amphibious teen could be direct with him or blunt with others, all without lessening either's badassness in the slightest. And best of all, She clearly didn't fear the boss. How does someone even walk away from something like that? Saki saw a floating uniform ask a pink-skinned girl. Said girl only shrugged in response, crazy black and gold eyes flicking from the boss to the shrimp and back again. This isn't right. A boring-looking tail blonde said to himself. And that new girl? He made another one. Saki felt an eye twitch. I'm forfeiting if I have to go anywhere near Midoriya in a battle trial. Whispered a sharp-faced idiot with funky-looking elbows to a buffoon with spiky blonde hair and a dim expression. Saki felt her teeth grind against each other. The fear. Now that, Saki took issue with. Fear was the one thing the blonde delinquent hated above all else. The trademark of the weak, not worth dealing with. Even now, the aggressive zombie girl could almost feel the way a number of the brats surrounding them feared her boss. Objectively, Saki knew fear was a natural emotion, an instinctual response to that which was dangerous. It could break the will of the weak just as easily as it could sharpen the minds of the strong, and that was a fact she knew all too well. Since the day she discovered she'd been destined to be saddled with a lame-ass quirk that gave her absolutely no advantages whatsoever in combat, she'd known the ins and outs of fear. Her old man had made sure of that. Ryuji Nikaido had been many things, but he'd made damn sure he educated his daughter on how to be a warrior. By the time she was 8, she'd been trained to the point no one could call her a weakling or defenseless and lived to tell about it. Hell, the blonde was pretty sure at this point that she was far more dangerous than half of the so-called heroes in training in the room. These classmates, they reeked of fear. They were afraid of her and her boss. Amazing powers and all the best training, and they were still. Saki, Izuku's stern voice, low as it was, reached the tense blonde without issue. No violence outside of training. Instantly, Saki felt her muscles unclench, her nerves soothe over, and her growing rage at the idiocy of those around her fall behind a cage of flowing crimson. Her boss had known. He'd known their feelings and hers. Of course he had. That's why he was such a badass, such a worthy boss. Everyone. The rough word was spoken plainly, but Saki caught how every brat in the room froze up at its utterance. Sit down. The order came from a gruff-looking man dressed in black with a dark white scarf wrapped around his neck. Apparently, he was the teacher, as every student in the room, besides the boss and Tsu, leapt to obey his words. One look was all it took, and Saki knew without question that the unkempt teacher of 1A had killed before. No matter how deadened he made his gaze, the blonde could tell just by looking at his coal-black eyes. Midoriya, the man rumbled, finally the boss snapping to attention. Why do you keep bringing girls to the classroom? As the boss stuttered out the explanation for her presence, Saki was sure of one thing. She sure as hell wasn't fucking with this guy. Later, UA cafeteria. One Izuku Midoriya, now sandwiched between his ever-protective Shadow Te and his ever-loving girlfriend Hyuazui, took a moment of peace in the chaos of the lunchtime rush and studied his life and struggles so far. He examined the bullying he'd suffered, the stigma he'd lived under, the struggles, dismissals, and agonies both physical and mental. Then, he held those events against the victories he'd had recently. Strangely enough, the green-haired teen felt happy, content even. It all made just a little bit more sense now, thinking back. He'd never been a true regenerator. No one, including himself, ever wanted to be sick or injured. So, his quirk had prevented or repaired damage of any kind his body accrued. Healing capability? He'd never been one to stand by while others were hurt if he could help them. His quirk had reacted accordingly and washed away whatever stood in its path to his happiness. Control, the most hated of his blood side effects. For most of his life, he'd been ignored, marginalized by a society stacked against him. He'd been abandoned by everyone save his mother for the longest time, who wouldn't have wanted to be heard. His quirk had answered his loneliness with full force. Since the day he'd met her, he'd found Tsu-chan attractive. She'd been the friendliest girl, besides his mother, he'd ever met at the time. Pushing their relationship forward always flooded him with endorphins, and his quirk must see that as positive reinforcement. Aizawa-sensei had initially displayed impartiality when dealing with him, a first for school staff. And a few times the man had even shown that he was willing to listen to him, really listen. His quirk had taken the initiative and softened the hardened underground pro-hero even further, making the man far more agreeable and willing to help. And in regards to Tae, Lily, and Saki, well, he was still working on why they were the way they were, but they looked happy with their current lives. The successful recovery of Inko Midoriya was the backbone for much of Izuku's musings. His mother had healed so quickly the doctors had begged to study him and his quirk until the freshly recovered woman had put her foot down and kicked them all out of her room. And then she'd turned right around and given her son a piece of her mind. That's right, heart fully mended and eyes gleaming vermilion. Inko had sat up in her bed and scolded Izuku until she'd run out of words to throw at him. She'd grounded him too for the remainder of the weekend. And then, after all of that, she'd started up on an impressive lecture on the importance of not placing his life in danger. Izuku had cried for much of the time, but his own heart had been as light as a feather. Cursed blood was a sinister quirk, there was no doubt about that, but it was also obedient to a fault. The idea that he could faithfully use his quirk to save people, save lives, without strings attached, and be a real hero was finally beginning to settle into Izuku's mind. He might be screened and observed for the rest of his life due to his abilities and how dangerous they made him, but for once those possibilities felt minute in the face of the positive emotions welling up inside of him. Izuku knew he was nowhere near completely over the effects his childhood and society had wrought upon him, but for once the green-haired teen honestly felt hopeful. "Are you all right, Izukuin?" Kyu asked softly to her boyfriend, who'd been staring into space for the past few minutes. The amphibious teen squeezed one of the Verdinette's hands. She was worried, and for good reason. Her mother's daughter, Kyu, always made sure to keep abreast of what went on around her in the world at large. And recently, it seemed all anyone could talk about was the young man sitting beside her. In concerning numbers, it seemed the press at large was leaning towards vilifying her boyfriend. The news outlets by and large callously strove to use the unfortunate events of his life to gain more popularity and sales for themselves. It irked the frog girl to no end that the media would bring overwhelming attention to the darker side of Izuku's quirk while completely glossing over its positives. Zombies. The anchors and reporters couldn't shut up about them. Saving 2 people from certain death in 2 separate events while also preventing crippling injuries? Not a single second of airtime. Yeah, Izuku replied, dragging himself out of his introspection. He returned his girlfriend's gentle squeezing lovingly. I think I had a. At that moment, Saki, who'd been agreeable enough to retrieve her boss another round of katsudon from the famous lunch rush, snarled so loudly her voice easily eclipsed half of the noise of the cafeteria. "What were you fucking going, Casper?" The blonde's tone conveyed more irritation than true anger. "And maybe stop dragging Mushroom Head there like a goddamn piece of luggage. I swear to fucking God if you'd made me drop the bosses. Cease your vulgar reprimands, you cretin." If the blonde delinquent's shouting hadn't caught the attention of most of the cafeteria, then the singular voice that spoke out against her did the job. Suddenly, the bustling food court had largely quieted, stray murmurings catching up those unaware of what was going on. Izuku, already having jumped out of his seat at the first sign of Saki's agitation, paused behind the blonde, taking in the situation. The green-haired teen's latest partner stood tall, imperiously glaring down at a Sylvette and the brunette whose hand she still held. Behind the 2 quaking girls stood a third, whose most noticeable feature was her piercing gaze and writhing, forest green hair of thorny vines. The air quickly became tense as crimson met dark pine, and neither budged an inch. Then, to make matters worse, the 3 who'd managed to earn Saki's ire noticed Izuku's approach, which set off the braver of the trio. "You," the vine-haired student accused, pointing a finger at the Verdinette as if he were the worst criminal imaginable. "Izuku Midoriya." "Huh? Me?" the boy in question asked, clearly unaware of why he was being singled out. Used to having his name spoken in derisive tones much harsher than the girl in front of him could probably ever manage, Izuku was still confused as to what he'd done to warrant such treatment from a complete stranger. A tingling set off under the Verdinette's skin, his stomach already set to tie itself into knots. He'd been having such a good moment too. "Yes, you," the plant-based girl shouted back. "This delinquent's behavior pales in comparison to your sins, devil. I've seen and read all about how you have profaned the dead with your foul quirk. Release their souls now. Give them peace." Stunned silence. None of the observers in the cafeteria could believe what they'd just heard. None even knew how to react to such a declaration. Student and staff alike were all too shocked to act. That is, all but a certain blonde delinquent. Huh. Saki's outburst shifted the collective attention away from her frozen boss and onto her, especially that of the plant cunt. Do you want to die, bitch? The vine-haired girl took a step back, apprehension flittering across her once self-righteous visage. That tone, the body language the blonde possessed, that look in near glowing crimson eyes. She really meant it. The girl had no idea who this delinquent was, but she was sure down to her bones that she'd never been on the receiving end of such open malice and desire for violence before. It honestly terrified her. Wait, crimson eyes? From where he continued to stand behind Saki, Izuku allowed the shock and hurt of such a denouncement roll over him and dissipate. For once in his life, the green-haired teen felt no pricks of guilt or lingering doubt cloud his mind in the face of ignorant opposition. The words just spoken were wrong. He knew and accepted that, and this time he wasn't going to stand for them. After all, the vine-haired girl had just basically told him to kill his partners, demanded he force them to experience death a second time before they were ready to move on. And that kind of pissed him off. What? Saki exploded again, seeming to tower over the girl who'd thought to challenge her, call for her second death, and then acted so cowardly. Do I need to rip out your tongue to hear your horseshit again? The ones still on the floor, Casper and Mushroom Head, chose that moment to scramble to their feet and retreat behind the vine-haired bitch. The duo turned once safely behind their friend, but the burning glare Saki directed at the two caused them to freeze up once again. The girls in question couldn't even quiver. Their fear was so gripping. Looking at the blonde was like staring at Medusa. Saki. Izuku calling her name caused the delinquent to snap out of her glowering, backing off to shift and place herself at the green-haired teen's left side. Realizing she probably wouldn't get to crack any skulls, the blonde crossed her arms and gave a savage grin for effect instead. The three strangers who'd begun this whole mess took a collective breath, the two behind the vine-haired girl sagging in relief. They immediately regretted doing so as the verdunette who'd stepped between them and the violent blonde fixed them with a hard stare of his own. The girls I've raised may be undead, Izuku said, surprising those in 1A who'd been watching, with his articulation in such a situation, but they deserve a chance to live their lives just like anyone else. So please, do not tell me you think they should die again. While he spoke the words softly and rather kindly, the glares of half of Izuku's classmates were very much not so. Momoyerozu in particular looked as if the vine-haired girl had tried to murder her own family. The mature teen tightened her grip on Lily as the widened eyes of the three strangers glanced their way. Well, came a sing-song voice. Blinking, Izuku looked behind the trio before him and saw a blonde from one of the lunch table 1B normally sat at stand up. Seeing he'd gained the attention of his audience, the newcomer's face grew smug. Isn't it quite the surprise that Yue's monster, for all his fame, is so soft-spoken? The previously uninvolved douchebag raised his arms wide, as if showcasing his discovery to the crowd that was still watching. The teen's cunning gaze and twitching lips were clear tells the blonde held no respect for the green-haired necromancer, and his words weren't meant as a compliment. Just the same, he sauntered closer to his target. I'll say, your brood of a slave they're really scared Shiozaki-san, and poor Yanagi-san and Komori-san too, the conniving teen said, chuckling slightly. Izuku narrowed his eyes as the boy stopped only feet away from him, smirk still present, as if he hadn't just purposefully crossed a line. And what kind of classmate would I be if I let Yue's monster walk all over 1B's members? Izuku quirked a brow, not for a minute buying the blonde's bullshit, and he wasn't the only one. Even not directed at him, the green-haired teen could feel the glares from his friends in 1A intensify, especially those he could almost tell came from Tsuchan and his partners. One that seems to enjoy escalating a situation. Izuku deadpanned, pointing out the obvious, and insulting others with uncalled-for nicknames. The blonde moved his hands in a half-hearted placating gesture, pulling a sweet smile that curdled for anyone watching with even half a brain. No one believed the 1B student held any good intentions whatsoever. We didn't come up with the moniker, the smirking teen replied, acting as if he were completely innocent. All we in 1B did was do a little research after our peers in 1A went through their little incident at the USJ. After the teachers incessantly sang their praises and acted like nothing we did would ever match up. After it seemed like you all were suddenly so outside of our reach, we couldn't stand it anymore. The innocuous smile on the blonde's face curved and became pure wickedness. And do you know what we found? Izuku felt a bit of unease creep into his spine at the creepy look the 1B member was giving him. It was an unholy cross between superiority and gotcha. The green-haired teen was glad Saki was still by his side. Even though he'd never set the aggressive zombie girl on a fellow UA student outside of training, it was nice to have backup that wasn't stuck at their table. It turned out that 1A was harboring a real nightmare. The blonde exclaimed, eyes wide as he passionately gestured to the bewildered Verdinette across from him. We all watched as you were shot in the head, and then stood up like it was nothing. A little digging, and what do you know, one Izuku Midoriya has quite the checkered past. And it all starts with his villainous quirk that he's tried to keep under wraps so he could walk among us like he belongs here. The blonde was breathing heavily now, his sermon complete. Now no one would look at 1A the same again. Heroes? Those scum had a villain in the making in their ranks, and they acted like it was nothing. They didn't deserve to be the face of UA. They didn't deserve to be special. Taking the venomous words in, Izuku looked away from the accusatory blonde, beginning to mumble up a storm. This had been an unforeseen consequence of the rogue newscast, but in hindsight, it had probably been inevitable. And strangely, the green-haired teen found he could live with this. The ignorance of the public, classmates, and even other heroes in training now felt like a lot less heavy of a weight to him. However, if it began to affect his partners, friends, or worse, Suchan, then the Verdinette knew the guilt he'd feel would be too much to handle. So the question was, how did he proceed in a way that focused the outcome of this confrontation on only himself and left the others untouched? Immersed in his own thoughts, Izuku completely missed the fact that the ruthless blonde who'd outed him to the entirety of UA's student body had slowly positioned himself closer while he'd spoken. Still in his own little word, the Verdinette also missed how the blonde raised a hand sharply above his head, the slap already in motion as it zeroed in on the back of his head. Chomp. Aha. All plans of copying the monster's quirk and putting his abominations to sleep for good in a bid to increase his class's popularity fled the blonde's mind as he felt jaws of steel clamp onto his hand and clench. The pained, girly shriek snapped Izuku from his whirlwind thoughts. Blinking rapidly back to reality, the green-haired teen nearly gasped. Tay had one of the blonde's hands in her mouth. And somehow her normally deadened eyes were giving the teen a look that promised murder bloody enough to make Saki proud. Shiozaki and the other two girls from 1B screamed in horror. Those close enough to witness what had happened, and weren't from 1A, froze in terror. For those in the know, such as Kyuka and Fumikage, they were slightly amused. The jerk from 1B had been about to do something to Izuku, and face the consequences. And honestly, they and many of 1A felt the blonde deserved it after everything he'd said. Enough! The roar came from a new girl, a redhead with blazing teal eyes, who for some reason reminded those of 1A of their class president. In one smooth motion, the newcomer had whipped out a hand and chopped the still screaming blonde in the back of the neck. As soon as the body connected to the hand in her mouth went limp, Tay released her prisoner. The blonde collapsed to the floor in a boneless heap, eyes rolled into the back of his head. Please, forgive Monoma. The redhead apologized on behalf of the knocked-out blonde with a gentle bow. He just can't seem to help himself when he thinks he can get attention. Beside her boss, Saki snorted at the attempt at peacekeeping. Attention had been the least of the blonde dumbass goals. She could just tell. Before the undead delinquent could call out. However, the redhead had turned and affixed the three girls from 1B with a stern look of reprehension. And you three, the peacekeeper said, tone disappointed, apologize to Midoriya already. You especially Ibra. I can't believe you'd say those things. The Sylvette, who Izuku guessed was either Yanagi or Komori, bowed to him without a word. The brunette did the same, and even through long, thick bangs, the green-haired teen could tell the shorter of the two was staring hard at him. Unfortunately, he had little hope of discovering why before both had scampered back to the 1B table they must have come from before bumping into Saki. That left Ibara Shiozaki, and the vine-haired girl did not look happy. But it's Kendo-san. Shiozaki pleaded he's. Whatever defense the plant-based teen had was cut off as the redhead, Kendo, overrode her voice. Made it into UA just like everyone else here. He deserves some respect, for that alone, if nothing else. Now, apologize. The hard words cowed the spirit of the vine-haired girl, who turned to Izuku and gave a stiff bow. Huffing, Shiozaki stalked back to sit with the other two 1B girls. Speechless, Izuku couldn't help but blush. He'd never had someone outside of his friends and Tsuchan demand others show him respect before. It was a new experience for the green-haired teen, one that his expressionless girlfriend was keen to observe, not that he knew that. Why you didn't need to have them do that, Izuku said, his long-suppressed shyness coming to the fore at the worst possible time. Desperate to think of some way to change topics, the Verdinette happened to glance at the unconscious blonde at their feet. Hopefully, Monoma-san will understand that Taechan didn't mean him any harm. She's just really protective of me. The peacekeeper from 1B nodded, glad that she seemed to have come in time to keep her class's most combative member from starting a feud. If his target was willing to talk, then surely the situation could still be completely defused. I'm sure he will. We all saw what she did in the courtroom. Kendo replied, unsure if her words would be taken well if she continued to speak. I reckon she could have torn him to pieces long before anyone could have stopped her. Right. Izuku grimaced. That kind of thinking was not the image he wanted his partners to be branded with. And Taechan, as his longest-running and most reliable risen, definitely deserved better. You did a great job of training her? Kendo's latest olive branch might as well have been a lit match to the young necromancer. Tense shoulders, grit teeth, a feeling of heat rising from his stomach to pool in his chest. Izuku had to forcibly hold himself back from the overzealous reaction his body ached to give. He swallowed thickly. It wasn't her FAU. They're not trained dogs, you know. Surprisingly, or not, it was the commanding voice of one Kyukijiro that rose up from the silence to correct the insulting misconception. The loud clarification of the now standing rocker girl earned the full attention of the students of 1B and the rest cafeteria. What? Kendo stuttered, looking aghast as her gaze jumped from Kyuka to Izuku. The paling of the redhead's already light complexion gave away the fear that had managed to edge into Peacekeeper's heart. They? But the reports I read only mention one. Kendo-san. And Shiozaki was back, giving Izuku the stink eye as she gently tugged on the redhead's sleeve. He has sullied more than one corpse with his quirk. The child from the trial footage, the one sitting over there, is one of his zombies as well. And so is she. Shiozaki's flat but informative words came along with an accusatory finger pointing right at the delinquent who'd threatened her earlier. The vine-haired girl knew her guess was correct when the blonde glared daggers at her in response. My friend's quirk may have bridled the darkness to give his partner's life once more, Fumikage Tokoyami suddenly said. But they are all warriors of justice. Kendo, shocked by what she'd just learned, couldn't decide who to look at. Her teal eyes bounced from the now statuesque form of Tae to the cutely pouting face of the child she'd seen from the trial footage to the snarling delinquent who'd insulted and nearly attacked her classmates. It was a lot to take in. It was. Without another word, Itsuka Kendo seemed to blank out. The redhead turned, grabbed Nito Monoma by the scruff of his uniform, and walked away. Suddenly left alone with forces that frankly terrified her, Ibara Shiozaki beat a hasty retreat back to her table once more as well. Taking in the calculating, inquisitive, and judgmental gazes of the rest of UA's student body, Izuku could only sigh again. Feeling a sturdy pat on the back from Saki, the green-haired teen could only shake his head. He hoped he wouldn't get into any trouble over this. Hours later, Nizu's office, lobby. I am many things, sir, but I'm no snitch. The hardline assertion from Monoma, the blonde that had given Izuku so much trouble at lunch, only annoyed the green-haired teen more as he heard it a second time. When the announcement had come over 1A's intercom that his presence was requested in the principal's office, many of his classmates had been outraged. 1B's instigation of the confrontation was shouted out multiple times, though not quite drowning out the few snide comments that this was the logical and fair course of action. In the end, their opinions, while overall supportive, didn't matter. Izuku had to go. Perhaps the green-haired teen was lucky to get out of the classroom for a little while. The proposition Ida had made right before he left, that he stepped down as vice president, had nearly started a civil war. Equals flashback equals 1A classroom. Midoriya-san, it is my honest and unbiased opinion that temporarily stepping down from your position would be the best thing for you, the bespectacled and stern speedster had stated in his usual loud fashion. At least until you've sorted out what you wish to do with the media. I fear that left unchecked your current problems may negatively impact your performance in carrying out your responsibilities. Or worse, hurt your academic record. Thinking nothing of his classmates' words other than their surface value, Izuku had waved off the concern. Thank you, Ida-san, but don't worry about me, the green-haired teen had said. But my quirk. And who would replace him during his sabbatical? Momo had uncharacteristically interrupted, seeming to cut to the most important point before Izuku had even thought of it. You, Ida-san? The serious speedster had acted as if the mature young woman had slapped him in the face. Ida had then rubbed the back of his neck, unable to look at either of his classmates. Well, you would be the one to choose, without question, the bespectacled teen had admitted after a moment. But I would of course volunteer. Izuku had left the decision in the hands of 1A's president, more than happy to abide by her authority. Unexpectedly, at least for him, Momo had almost instantly shot Ida down. Apparently his OCD tendencies were a bigger help to their mature classmate than he'd thought, as they were one of the many examples of his abilities she'd brought up when she'd informed the speedster that he wouldn't be able to come close to matching his skills as an assistant. Who'd have thought? Equals flashback, E&D equals. Present, Nizu's office, lobby. We should just break his legs, Saki proposed, bringing Izuku back to his current job of keeping his partners from permanently maiming the infuriating blonde. Or kill him. Take and eat his body to hide the evidence. The dark humor caused Izuku to facepalm. Beside the green-haired teen, Monoma began to quiver in fear. Nana. Tei's answering groan earned a chuckle from the blonde delinquent, while Lily giggled so hard she almost fell out of her seat. Lily agrees, the brunette said through her laughter. Eating trash would be bad for your tummy, Tene. That affront was just enough to break through Monoma's growing distress. Trash, the blonde shouted, outraged. One sharp look from 3 pairs of crimson eyes had the 1B student clamming up tight, though too scared to further defend himself. Finally, the door to the principal's actual office opened, causing all present to stand and snap to attention. Nizu appeared, the quirked animal looking none too pleased. Behind him, 2 well-dressed and suited individuals followed. Izuku gulped. Kyurei agents. Midoriya-san, thank you for coming so quickly. Nizu greeted one of his favorite students before turning to the blonde present. Monoma-san, I apologize for this, but these individuals are here to have a word with Midoriya-san. Unfortunately, we'll have to tackle your issue late. The principal was cut off before he could even finish his business as one of the agents decided that their time was too valuable to waste on manners. That won't be necessary. The woman of the pair, a redhead, snapped. Izuku bristled as the agent with the name tag labeled R. Musashi acted like she owned the school. The woman's partner stepped forward, self-importance clear to see. We're only here to collect the reanimated corpse of one Saki Nikaido. The man, who sported odd periwinkle hair, added as if he'd merely requested a signature. The name tag hanging from his breast pocket read R. Kojiro. You may get back to your business after you've handed it over. Izuku was speechless, completely caught off guard. He'd thought this had been taken care of. Detective Tsukachi had assured him the paperwork had been filed. In spite of his confusion, the green-haired teen never lost the tight frown that spoke of thinly veiled rebellion. Picking up how his student was restraining himself, Nizu couldn't help but lightly smile. You have no right, Izuku said, nearly shouting. Without thinking, the green-haired teen threw back a hand, silencing Saki before she could say anything to make the situation worse. He'd apologize later. I have a license for her. Now, Izuku wasn't one to challenge authority normally, but he wasn't going to sit back and just surrender Saki without a fight. She'd sworn to become a hero alongside him, and he wasn't about to let that oath be broken. Even if her exact words had been she agreed to be his henchwoman. Wait, you have a license? Monoma asked, reminding Nizu of the blonde's presence. Clearing his tiny throat, the quirked animal gained the attention of the student Vlad King had long since advised him had an axe to grind against his class's sister class. While such a hang-up could be used for the betterment of all involved, now was clearly not the best time to begin leading the blonde in the right direction. Pity. Monoma-san, Nizu said, you're dismissed. The blonde continued to sit there, unsure if he was really getting off so easily. Nizu sighed, pinching the bridge of his snout. Monoma-san, the quirked animal said again, go back to class. Now, the blonde scampered away, the sight of a vexed Nizu enough to send him running. Sighing again, the quirked animal turned back to his latest and most aggravating annoyance. There was a misunderstanding with the permit issued, Musashi said, brushing off Izuku's words and growing temper. The license was allotted for one Ryuji Nikaido, not a third-rate delinquent who caused nothing but trouble when she was alive the first time. The office of UA's principal suddenly became frigidly cold, almost glacial. Now you're asking for it, bitch, Saki hissed, the zombie girl's absolute hatred burning through Izuku's silent command. I'm going to kill you so hard you're going to be reborn dead. The blonde wasn't the only one angered by the agent's callous remark. Tay was openly growling at the two, and the normally cheerful Lily was scowling at the pair. You can't have her, Izuku ground out, stepping between Saki and the QRA representatives. The green-haired teen's adorable face and smooth voice had hardened into something fierce. She is a sentient being with her own free will. She's not going anywhere unless she wants to. The hero in training thought back to Sunday night, when he'd faced a challenge he'd long since believed insurmountable, and had been rewarded handsomely for doing so. Remembering the thoughts and feelings that had filled him when he'd healed his mother, Izuku had given all three of his partners a top-off of blood. After the influx had settled, he'd asked for the trio's unfiltered opinion on remaining his partners. All three had answered with enthusiastically positive responses. Lily and Saki had been incredibly vocal about staying by his side. The littlest zombie had been adamant about fulfilling her revived desire to become an idol and hero the world would love and look up to. Saki's assurance had been more aggressive and rebellious, the blonde insisting that although she'd follow him, she wanted no part in continuing her old man's heroic legacy. Tay had merely looked at him as if she couldn't understand what he was asking and rolled her head forward onto his chest. He hadn't cried at that. He hadn't. And now some two-bit bureaucrats wanted to cut the wings off of one of his partners? Not on his watch. Off to the side, Nizu stood equal parts confused and full of pride. The quirked animal had been certain that after facing the relentlessness of the media, his dear student would be in dire need of counseling and support. Instead, Izuku Midoriya looked to be stronger, more sure of himself than he'd ever appeared to be before. It was as if the boy had overcome a number of his inner demons, and in such a short amount of time. Of course we can, and yes it is, the Periwinkle man countered with an all-too-smug voice. And since you barely seem to be able to control these things at the best of times, we might as well go ahead and take them all of your hands while we're at it. The glacial temperature of the room abruptly skyrocketed, Izuku containing his rage by the skin of his grit teeth. This had long since been a matter of retaining his potential to become a hero. This was about protecting his friends, partners, and family. The green-haired teen found himself taking a step forward, which caused a chain reaction of panic to shoot through his mind. For all he wanted to, and they deserved it, he couldn't actually attack agents of the QRA. Luckily, he wouldn't have to. Actually, no you can't, and no she won't, came an unexpected voice. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku blinked in shock as a woman seemed to appear out of seemingly thin air. The tall newcomer was impeccably dressed in a black suit and slacks, and spoke with an accent so refined it was impossible to determine her origins. She held up a steaming mug, the fragrant aroma spelling cocoa in the air. Oh my, Nisa dear, you just have to tell me who I have to kill to get this coffee brew of yours. The intruder instantly gained the attention of all involved, each person living and not, wondering how and when the woman had entered the office. They all took her in. The only identifying feature the newcomer wore was a name tag, reading only a single word, Smith. Her long raven locks appeared glossy and extremely well cared for, and almost blended in with her suit. The sunglasses she wore seemed off somehow, designed to conceal as much as possible but still appear sleek. They reflected no light whatsoever, as if cut from shards of Vanna Black or Black 2.0. Obviously not me, Smith-san. Nizu replied in a rarely seen jovial manner. Although Izuku could tell the hypergenius was somewhat wary of the woman. I'll be getting another bag in a few weeks, so feel free to take as much as your heart desires today. The woman, Smith, laughed heartily at the principal's words. She sipped from her mug with a flirty grin. I'll take your word for it. The gleeful reply did nothing to ease the growing feeling of dread that had slowly begun to fill the room. Far more hesitantly than she'd ever done before, Saki tugged on Izuku's shirt sleeve to gain his attention. Refusing to take his eyes off the newcomer who radiated an aura he'd never felt before, the green-haired teen subtly nodded for the blonde to speak. Boss, the normally rebellious zombie said, voice lowered as much as possible. I think she's a spook. I guessed as much, Izuku replied, surprising the adults present, except for Smith herself. Though whether it was from his deduction or the occupation of the intruder, the green-haired teen couldn't tell. Smith, interestingly enough, merely quirked a brow at the young hero in training. Oh, the intimidating woman asked, eyeing the green-haired teen who'd figured her out with a discerning gaze. You could tell? Izuku nodded, holding up a closed fist. Special anti-ballistic weave uniform with interwoven energy-resistant plating, the Verdinet stated, raising one finger as he referenced the woman's suit. He raised a second finger. Anti-reflective shades with integrated camera and microphone. Smith began to grin at the intelligence and observation skills of the youngling in front of her. Taichan didn't notice you entering. Izuku continued, raising another finger as his first partner slowly nodded and gave a grunt of affirmation. The fourth finger rose. And then there's the name. That's a code. The language might change, but all the other agents shared the same name tag too. Smith chuckled, amused beyond all expectation with the Verdinet. He was a special one. Izuku had let himself believe he was a lot of things over the years, but he'd never been a fool. Unlike most of the officers he'd encountered during his brief internship, who looked away when agents of Interpol had gotten involved with their work, he'd made sure to pay attention. Every detail of the members of the international organization had been committed to memory, even the schematics of their uniform, which he'd copied down to add to the next version of his hero costume. Detective Tsukachi had caught him looking at Agent Sato once, and had taken it upon himself to explain a few more things to him. According to him, back when the number of people with quirks had officially overtaken the quirkless worldwide, the major countries had agreed to officially dissolve their foreign intelligence agencies as a whole. The CIA, the reborn KGB, ASIS, MI6, China's still unnamed bureau, the list went on. Every one of them had been disbanded in the face of growing presence of superpowers. In response, Interpol had stepped in and absorbed as many capable agents as they could assure the loyalty of. The result had been temporarily chaotic, until the first director had put their foot down and combined like aspects of every operative's past agency to facilitate the transition. One such policy had been that protecting the true identity of agency was tantamount to sacred work, hence the universally accepted idea that all agents be named Smith or its equivalent in other languages. It increased the difficulty of an agent being found out. Many were assigned a Smith alias in a language not their own. Neo Mesa was right about you, kid, Agent Smith said, taking a sip of her coffee. I like you already. The encouraging words struck hard and deep. Izuku felt an odd sense of elation. Detective Tsukachi had been impressed with him and praised him as well, but this agent was on an international level and still said as much. It almost made the green-haired teen light-headed to even think about. The fact that it was a spook who'd praised him, a figure of shadow and walking nightmare that were as a group infamous for being killing machines and taking down their targets regardless of quirk, completely went over the hero in training's head. And what is Interpol doing sticking its nose in Japan's business? The woman, Musashi asked, her trepidation warring with her belief she was untouchable. It would be a disaster if the international agency decided they wanted to collect the undead for themselves. The tall Ravenet side-eyed the QRA agents through her shades, causing the duo to visibly shiver as a feeling of killing intent washed down their spines. To business then, Smith said instead of answering, reluctantly placing her mug of coffee on a side table. You two, feel free to go back to your cubicles and inform your boss that one Izuku Midoriya is now under the UN's jurisdiction as a probationary asset. This, of course, includes any and all uses of his quirk, ergo every undead he raises in the name of justice. Izuku blinked. He blinked again. A third blink did little to abate his confused disbelief. Had Smith just stated that he technically outranked the QRA at a legal level? We're not your gophers, Kojiro snarled. The periwinkle man was obviously against being ordered around. Smith shrugged in response, the antagonistic response sliding off of her without concern. Digging into her pocket, the spook pulled out her smartphone, the device already ringing. "Hello, Mr. G," Smith greeted, loud enough to be heard by the entire room. The QRA agents paled, distress evident on their faces. "It's Agent Smith." The spook gave a lopsided grin at whatever response she received over the phone. Unfortunately, the call was not on speaker. "Why I'm calling?" Well, as Smith trailed off, it looked as if Musashi and Kojiro were on the brink of begging. For what? Izuku didn't know. Thankfully. "Your kids were rude to me. What can I say?" The QRA agents slumped, realizing their fate had been sealed. Izuku took the scene in, amazed at how easily the international agent had taken the two rude operatives to task. It was honestly scary. "No, not those two. The ones you sent to collect the zombie girls," Smith corrected, the statement seeming odd to the green-haired teen. "Which, come to think of it, is strange because I'm pretty sure you have the memo ordering you to leave the boy alone on your desk." "Where?" "It should be right in front of you, under that silly mug of yours that says boss." The way Smith said it, so nonchalantly, as if knowing the ins and outs of someone's office were second nature to her, blew Izuku's mind. The green-haired teen could predict that whoever the spook was talking to was, well, spooked out of his skin. "Ah, so it was just an honest mistake then, yes?" Smith clarified, sweet voice curling into a venomous facsimile as she continued. "Then everything's all right. Just make sure you give your kids a proper scolding, and we won't have to have this conversation again. Bye now." Exactly 10 seconds after Smith had hung up, Musashi and Kojiro's phones rang at the same time. Without saying a word, the two QRA agents retreated. Izuku didn't need a clairvoyance quirk to know that by the expressions on the duo's faces, they'd be cleaning toilets for months to come. "Well, looks like most of my business is done here," Smith announced as she snatched up her coffee mug again. "But the rest can wait a bit. I think our cute little plushie has something important to say." Izuku unconsciously twitched at the description of his school's principal. The thought might have been accurate, but it required a rare level of bravery to even think of speaking it aloud. "Right." Nizu simply agreed, the quirked animal barely suppressing an eye twitch at the spook's words. "Midoriya-kun, as you may have noticed during your lunch period, our 1B class has appeared to have grown restless." They had hardly come to terms with 1A's great feat of heroism, as Kansans tells me they call the USJ incident, when your unfortunate experience at the courtroom became public. Seeing the bewildered confusion on the face of one of his most intelligent students caused the quirked animal to huff. Sometimes the principal of Japan's greatest hero school forgot how young and naive his newest protege still was, even in the face of hardships of his life. "They feel slighted, Midoriya-kun," Nizu said plainly, crossing his short arms as his own frustrations with the rivalry between the freshman hero course classes came to the surface. And Kansan repeatedly telling them that they aren't ready to face similar perils has only bloodied their overinflated sense of pride even further. Beginning to connect the dots, Izuku furrowed his brow, his mind replaying the day's events through a more contextual lens. "And as I'm sure you've no doubt guessed by now, we cannot and will not place students in danger purely for the sake of proving a point, or to indulge impatience and petty egotism," Nizu continued, the green-haired teen nodding at the accurate guess. Then, the principal's face, muzzle, whatever twisted, as if sudden indecision had taken hold of the normally stalwart quirked animal. "That being said, Midoriya-kun, I wish to—" "Oh, come on, Zuzu," Smith teased, a half-smile pulling a dimple from her angular face. "Don't get wet for now. The kid can take it." Midoriya was once again slapped in the face with the fact that the spook before him was someone that had the courage to speak to UA's principal so familiarly and playfully. But the woman's words also sent a tension through his body. It sounded like he wouldn't enjoy whatever was coming. "I have no doubt he can, Smith-san," Nizu agreed, completely ignoring the cutesy nickname that the spook had revealed to his student. The quirked animal turned to fully face the young hero in training before him that had already shouldered so many hardships, hoping he wouldn't be resented for adding one more. Given your brilliance, Midorikuan, I would like for you to devise a test of sorts for your peers in 1B. They need to be exposed to the dire conditions pro-heroes face in the real world, but in a controlled environment that will not negatively affect them in the long run. Immediately, Izuku could almost feel his mental gears beginning to turn in the back of his mind as he tried to digest the task his principal had laid out for him. A test to put 1B in life-threatening danger without it being truly life-threatening? It almost sounded like he was being asked to be a era, Smith drawled playfully, taking another sip of her coffee. You really did it, Nizu? Asked the poor boy to play the villain for you. Nizu snapped around to glower at the spook with a heavy look of displeasure. While the quirked animal didn't growl, Izuku could see the fine hairs at his principal's neck start to stand on end. Smith-san, Nizu grit out with forced control, I would never. It's all right. Izuku spoke up before the two could begin trading verbal blows. The green-haired teen took a deep, shaky breath. It makes sense. Both adults were struck silent by the sight of the verdinet before them. Neither had expected the young hero in training to so readily accept the proposal, much less with the wavering smile he'd plastered onto his face. Swallowing thickly, Izuku looked between Nizu and the spook and continued his point. Class 1B needs a wake-up call, or at least, that's what it seems like you're saying, sir, Izuku said, receiving a nod from the quirked animal. Smith raised an inquisitive brow. And historically speaking, it's been proven that it's the mastermind type of villain that can make or break heroes. Based on my experience at the USJ, and given the recent development of that moniker Monomasan was throwing around today and the footage from the trial, I can see why I would be a good choice to put them through this kind of test. Nizu blinked, unsure of what he was looking at for a moment. Had his student miraculously overcome his deeply ingrained trauma in moments? The thought birthed and died in seconds as the quirked animal looked closer and saw the truth. Minute shivers, just barely perceivable, racked the verdinet's frame. No, Izuku Midoriya hadn't completely conquered the demons of his past, but he seemed to have taken a great step in battling towards victory. The principal of UA wished the two were alone at that moment, so that he could express how proud he was of the green-haired teen. I think I can do it, Izuku said, hesitance clearly battling the rising steel of his conviction. The green-haired teen's observers visibly noticed as that steel set in to strengthen his spine, his back straightening, eyes hardening. My classmates went through hell, and some are still feeling the effects, I know, but they are all by and large better prepared for their future as heroes because of that hardship. Class 1B doesn't understand that yet, but they will. The grin Agent Smith wore at those words was wide and innocently wicked, causing Nizu even more concern than his student's abrupt and unforeseen maturation. What had he just done? Can we get a little rough with the little shits? Saki asked, the rebellious zombie girl wearing a viciously gleeful smile of her own as she punched one of her hands into its partner. That'll depend on the student, Izuku replied, deciding after a moment of thought. It was true as far as he could see. There would be some members of 1B that could take far more punishment than their fellows before any kind of lesson such as this would sink in. As the verdinet descended into a muttering spree, surrounded by the eager suggestions of Lily and Saki and the silent support of Tay, Agent Smith snorted at the sight. Turns out she'd had nothing to worry about after all. Izuku Midoriya, after a lifetime of stigma and systematic abuse, after learning the true nature of his quirk, after finally being given the honest thoughts of his undead partners, and after finally realizing that the dark power within him was his to control, had begun to embrace what he truly was. He was no monster, no born-to-be villain. He was no knight in shining armor either, no paladin or cleric. He was, and always would be, a sinister hero, and by all appearances at the moment, the green-haired teen looked to be able to live with that. It seemed having the ability to save everyone the way he'd always wished to was enough for the verdinet, even if those same people may fear him for how he went about his work. The spook slipped out of the office unnoticed, her old friend fixated on his student, and said student dead to the world as he brainstormed. For once, it looked like Smith would be able to submit a mission accomplished without leaving a trail of dead bodies in her wake. Today had been a good day. Later, evening, UA High School courtyard. Tenya Ida stood just outside of the institution he'd always dreamed of learning at, one of the key foundations of his country's future heroes, and felt dissatisfied and frustrated. The speedster hadn't revealed the information to his classmates, but his spur-of-the-moment attempt to alleviate some of Midoriya-san's responsibilities hadn't come as completely out of the blue as he'd let on. The bespectacled teen had spent many days speaking to his older brother and, more recently, Uraraka-san. Tensei had been the guiding light of experience that had allowed Tenya to realize, as unheroic as it was, that he didn't trust Midoriya-san because of his quirk. The Verdunette's abilities were far too dark and had too much potential for villainy for the younger Ida's liking. However, that same epiphany brought with it an enlightenment of sorts. Tenya had come to accept that his perspective was flawed, mired in ignorance and fear, and need to be corrected. The speedster now acknowledged that he needed to learn to live with the fact that all quirks, dark or light, could be used heroically. It came down to the user. It had helped that Uraraka-san had sat with him after he'd listened to her vent her issues and outright told him that from an outsider's perspective he appeared to be more than a little jealous of one, Ace Dark Cinnamon Roll. After all, the brunette had claimed, how could the brother of a renowned pro-hero like Ingenium be expected to feel when not only does he fail to become his class's president, but also its vice president, when a necromancer did? Tenya sighed, head drooping as he thought over the train wreck that had been his proposal. The idea had been to take Midoriya-san's place as vice president for a time, ascertain whether or not they tackled the inherent responsibilities any differently or with varying levels of success, and finally have a solid foundation with which to compare the two's mettle. Unfortunately, the bespectacled teen now feared his plan had caused his classmates to view him as a conniving scoundrel. The negative reaction to his suggestion that Midoriya step down, followed by his hesitant offer to take his place temporarily, had been far greater than he'd anticipated. If he'd been even a millisecond slower, he'd have been hit with Shiro-san's desk when Jiro-san had jumped to her feet in indignation and caused the hallowed furniture of their seniors to fly backwards. The yelling from the punk rock girl and others hadn't made him feel any better either. One last sigh escaped the younger Ida's son as he finally made his way off of school grounds. The bespectacled teen hoped with a heavy heart that tonight would be one of those rare nights Tensei would be able to get home for a family meal. He really needed more advice. Later, night, Midoriya residence. Inside the normally peaceful and warm domicile, cries of protestation and opposition could be heard. The matriarch of the family had been much more not okay with her baby, her radiant angel, agreeing to play the villain in some test that principal of his had cooked up than said child had expected. Izuku, of course, had tried to explain the situation and why he felt he could and should participate, but Inko Midoriya had never been an easy woman to convince. Unbeknownst to the occupants of the currently quarreling home, outside the dwelling, a single QRA agent was keeping watch over the area. After the near disaster earlier in the day with the spook, the big boss of the agency had issued a new memo. Orders now were to keep to a watch and report routine. Interpol had apparently been incredibly explicit in describing the breadth of their authority when it came to the Emerald Necromancer, which was none whatsoever. In spite of that, the inherent danger posed by undead freely walking around hadn't been completely ignored. The QRA had been given leave to at least post some kind of token surveillance. The single agent stationed outside the Midoriya household had other ideas, however. Capturing one of the undead girls, one that had just happened to wander off and become unsupervised, would set the nondescript woman for life, or at minimum, in a key position for a major promotion. And the agent even had the perfect target. Of the necromancer's 3 tools, the one with the least observed intelligence appeared to be functionally dead to the world so long as her owner wasn't in danger. Taking that one down would be child's play. Watching, the woman hid herself as best she could as the Ravenet of the undead trio exited the Midoriya's home with a number of trash bags in hand. Her opportunity had arrived. Everyone thinks I'm a failure. The QRA agent slunk through the shadows, approaching her quarry without making a sound. The undead shambled towards the apartment complex's communal dumpster without missing a beat. I usually get ignored most of the time, and no one really listens when I try to speak up. Patiently, the agent waited until the mindless undead had opened the lid of the dumpster. When the moment was right, she struck. Got you, the agent hissed, barely suppressing the urge to shout. Snapping her arm out, the woman jabbed her target with her common-issue taser. Huh. Tay leaned her head back, eyeing the woman whom she'd noticed had been creeping up on her with a dead, empty ruby stare. Following the attacker's outstretched arm, the zombie girl saw a weapon of some sort was poking her. Based on the random sparks that would shoot from the metal prongs that were jabbing her ribs, it was shock-based. Is this thing working? The unknown woman shouted, instantly losing her cool facade when she no doubt realized her weapon had no effect. Pulling her arm back, Tay's attacker turned the dial on her taser up to maximum. Let's try that again. A few seconds pass, and the sparks from the taser continue to shoot out, showing the stun tool was in fact working to no effect. Tay, almost gently, took the weapon from the clearly confused woman's hands. Wide-eyed, the unfortunate would-be attacker watched as the zombie girl turned the dial back down to medium. Then the undead Ravenette jabbed the woman with the taser, zapping her strongly enough to immediately knock her unconscious. After a few moments, and not a few more failed attempts, Tay was able to stuff the woman who'd attacked her into the dumpster. Nearly finished, the zombie girl wrapped up by placing the full bag of trash she'd been tasked with throwing out on top of the woman. Oi, Tay! The boorish shout from Saki carried to Tay with little problem. Turning, the Ravenette stared emptily back at the glaring blonde. What's taking you so long, Wonder Girl? The delinquent snarked, tossing a thumb over her shoulder. Come on. Gninaha, Tay groaned in response, earning a huff from the blonde rebel. Well, if the trash is putting up that much of a fight, call for help, Saki snapped, mumbling something that sounded an awful lot like weirdo under her breath right after. Now hurry up, the boss doesn't like you out here wandering around by yourself. Instead of groaning again, Tay simply nodded, throwing the last of her trash bags into the dumpster. Right as Saki pulled her head back into the Midoriya's apartment, the head of the QRA agent poked up from the piles of refuse. The woman appeared quite dazed. Why you? The woman groused, finding it difficult to even speak. You can't do this to me. Wham, crack. The lid of the dumpster slammed onto the QRA agent's head, silencing the woman's building tirade before it began. A muffled thump echoed from inside the trash receptacle, followed by a barely discernible moaning. Idiot. The insult, spoken in a raspy voice hardly used, went unheard by the world. Without a backwards glance, Tay straightened and walked back to the place she called home. As she neared the front door, her limbs returned to their listless ways, causing her to shuffle the last few feet. It's okay though, I guess. I suppose I really don't care if the world ignores me anymore. After all, I already have the attention of the most important person in my life. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed Support the Writer. Don't forget to like, sub, and share.